What if Jesus had children? What if his bloodline didn't end on the hill of Golgotha, but traveled quietly through the centuries, crossing seas and borders, surviving assassinations and betrayals, protected by kings, hidden by knights, and hunted relentlessly by popes? And what if the legendary Holy Grail was never a jeweled chalice at all, but something far more dangerous, a living, breathing lineage, one that may still walk among us today? You've heard fragments of this idea before. The whispered theories of Don Brown, the mysterious symbols of Da Vinci, the shadowy histories of the Knights Templar. But what if, beneath all the fiction and exaggeration, there was something older, stranger, more dangerous than we've been taught to imagine? This is the story of a royal family erased from history, a code not written in any book, but inscribed in human blood. And after centuries of silence, that story is whispering again. To truly hear it, you must slow down. Let the centuries peel back like layers of ancient vellum. Let the popular myths grow quiet. Let your breath find the rhythm of darkened stone corridors where kings once walked, their footsteps echoing against walls heavy with incense and secrets. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation that spans empires, reshapes churches, and lies buried beneath the soil of forgotten graves. And, as so many great secrets do, it begins with a death. The year was 679. A deep chill settled into the forests of the Ardennes. Birds fell silent in the canopy. The damp earth smelled of pine and decay. And somewhere along a half-forgotten Roman road, something sacred was shattered. Dagobert II, the last fully sovereign king of the Merovingian line, was murdered, reportedly, on the orders of the church itself. Some chroniclers say a spear struck his eye. Others claim a blade slipped quietly across his throat. The details vary, but the conclusion does not. Dagobert was the last obstacle, and once he was gone, the door stood wide open for a new kind of ruler, more compliant, more useful, and most importantly, without divine blood. Because the Merovingians didn't claim to be merely kings, they claimed to be sacred, descended not only from King David, not only from Abraham, but from something older, still reaching back to the shores of Galilee, to a carpenter's household, to a woman with red hair fleeing across the sea, carrying a child and a prophecy. It sounds impossible. It sounds like a fever dream born on the edges of conspiracy forums, but history has always hidden its most dangerous truths under the guise of lunacy. And the deeper you step into this story, the harder it becomes to dismiss. The Merovingian kings ruled vast territories, much of what is now France, Belgium, and Germany. They were marked by strange customs. They never cut their hair, believing it was a source of divine strength. They claimed prophetic visions. They relied more on mysticism than brute force to maintain power. The people revered them as chosen by God. Many feared them as semi-divine beings. And then, almost overnight, they vanished. There was no great war to overthrow them, no violent rebellion to shatter their dynasty. They simply disappeared. Their names were scraped from official records. Their tombs were hidden, their children hunted. In their place rose the Carolingians, the dynasty that gave us Charlemagne, the dynasty the church wanted in power. And yet, centuries later, fragments of the Merovingian past still surface, coded manuscripts, symbols carved in forgotten places, whispered names passed through secret societies, mentions in banned gospels, and always the same unsettling question: why did the Church work so hard to erase them? Some say the Merovingians were heretics. Others insist they were too powerful, too independent, too deeply rooted in magic. But the most dangerous theory of all, the one we will explore tonight, is that they were removed not because of what they did, but because of who they were. And maybe because of who they still might be. Because blood does not vanish, it flows through centuries, through generations, through veins, and perhaps through someone alive today. So, settle in, dim the lights. Let your curiosity and let your doubts rest in the corner for a while. You are about to step into a mystery older than kings, deeper than dogma, sharper than any sword ever raised in its defense. Picture it now, a dense forest, damp and cold, the mist rising from the ground in ghostly swirls, the scent of wet pine thick in the air. A hunting party moves cautiously beneath the trees. At its center rides Dagobert, King of Austrasia, wrapped in a heavy royal cloak of deep blue. His face is lined by age and experience, but his eyes burn with an inner fire, a sense of purpose that seems almost out of place in this quiet wood. This would be the last journey he would ever take. The details of his final moments are scarce. Some accounts suggest he was separated from his guards. Others claim betrayal by a trusted servant. Either way, the result was the same: the king lay dead, and with him something older than the crown itself. What followed was stranger than the killing. Chroniclers simply stopped writing, not just about Dagobert, but about the entire line he came from. It was as if the ink itself froze in mid-air, and the royal blood sank into the earth without a sound. Dagobert II was no failed ruler. In fact, he had only recently returned from exile in Ireland, where he lived under the Church's protection. His return to the throne had been sanctioned by bishops and nobles alike. He had friends in high places. And yet, within a handful of years, he was gun-murdered under circumstances so suspicious that the lack of outrage was itself suspicious. Kings do not disappear without consequence, unless someone very powerful wanted them gone and forgotten. And the strangest part of all, Dagobert's son, Sigisbert, should have inherited the throne. He was alive, legitimate, the heir. Yet there was no coronation, no ceremony, no record of resistance. His name slipped from the pages of history like a stone sinking into a black well. Some claim he fled south to the region we now call Languedoc. Others whisper he was hidden in a monastery by loyal monks, and a few braver still say he was spirited away to a small village in the Pyrenees, where he lived under another name, and where his descendants may still walk today. It smells like a cover-up, and if your skin is prickling at the thought, you are not alone. Because Dagobert II was not just a king, he was the last of a very specific kind of king. The Merovingians claimed to be more than chosen by God. They believed they carried divine blood itself. Unlike most rulers who leaned on military might or papal blessing, the Merovingians saw themselves as sacred by birth. They never cut their long hair, believing it to be a channel for spiritual power. Their kings were said to be born under rare celestial alignments, capable of healing with a touch, and gifted with visions of the future. Their authority came not from Rome, but from the heavens. And for many early Christians, that blurred the line between monarch and saint, dangerous concept for a church seeking absolute control. A king who did not need the church to legitimize him was a problem. A king who hinted at a bloodline reaching back not just to David, but to a crucified carpenter, was a threat. Of course, mainstream historians dismiss such claims. The Gospels are silent on the idea that Jesus had children. Any suggestion otherwise is branded speculative, heretical even. But fringe documents persist. The so-called Gnostic Gospels, oral traditions whispered in remote valleys. The Gospel of Philip, for instance, calls Mary Magdalene the companion of Jesus' word, which, in its original Greek, can mean spouse. Interpretations vary. Scholars argue, certainty slips like water through your hands. Still, the idea endured, especially in parts of Europe where Roman authority was weaker, and older traditions clung stubbornly to the stones of ancient churches. The Merovingians ruling Gaul in the chaotic vacuum after Rome's fall had room to weave their own legends, and if those legends claimed a sacred ancestry, you can see why the church, desperate to unify doctrine and tighten its grip, might see them as dangerous. Here lies the real tension. If Dagobert II died because of what he believed, or worse, because of the blood that ran through his veins, then his assassination wasn't just a political maneuver, it was something far more dangerous. It was theological. It was a crime committed not merely to claim a throne, but to silence a legacy, to smother a dangerous idea before it could grow. One of the strangest pieces of evidence supporting this theory doesn't come from some dusty medieval scroll, but from a 20th century document, an unlikely relic in its own right. It's called the Dossier Secret de Rennes-le-Château, quietly filed away in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. On the surface, it's just another esoteric curiosity, the sort of thing you might expect to find buried in the archives of conspiracy theorists. But the dossier makes an audacious claim that Dagobert's bloodline didn't die with him. Instead, it survived in secret, protected by a mysterious brotherhood known as the Priory of Sion. According to its pages, Sigisbert, Dagobert's young son, escaped his father's fate and fled south, founding a hidden dynasty. This bloodline never sought the throne again, never openly declared its rights. Instead, it lived quietly, deliberately, guarding its heritage through the centuries. A lineage kept alive not in the glare of history, but in the shadows. The dossier is, of course, controversial. Many historians dismiss it as a mid-20th century fabrication and elaborate hoax. But even its critics admit that it contains an unsettling level of obscure medieval detail. The precise layout of certain forgotten tombs, the intricacies of ancient heraldic lineages, references that would be difficult for a forger to invent without intimate knowledge of arcane history. And there's another strange wrinkle. The dossier was deposited decades before the Da Vinci Code turned these ideas into pop culture fodder. In other words, someone was telling this story long before it was fashionable to chase grails through cathedrals. This leaves us with an uncomfortable question, one that still hangs in the air above the forest floor where Dagobert fell. If there was nothing to hide, if this was just another dead king, why was there so much effort to erase him, not just politically, but spiritually, symbolically, even genealogically? The silence surrounding Dagobert's death doesn't feel like a historical footnote. It feels like a deliberate redaction, a paragraph in the book of history that someone has inked out, a space where something either holy or deeply dangerous once stood, and that silence still echoes. Now, picture yourself stepping into a shadowed hall of memory. The air is heavy with the scent of incense and old iron. The light filtering in is dim, almost reverent, as though even the sun feels the weight of the centuries here. The floor is stone, worn smooth by the slow passage of countless feet. At the far end of this hall sits a throne not gilded with gold, but carved from dark, ancient wood. Its surface is alive with intricate carvings, serpents twisting among curling vines, bees poised mid-flight, each symbol laden with meaning. But there is no crown upon this throne. Instead, there rests a single lock of long golden hair. Welcome to the world of the Merovingian kings rulers, not only of land, but of legend. From the 5th to the 8th century, this dynasty held sway over vast swaths of what we now call France and much of Western Europe. They were known as the Rex Chronotus, the long-haired king's a title that wasn't some romantic flourish, it was law. A Merovingian ruler was never to cut his hair. The long locks weren't vanity, they were sacred. It was believed that a king's hair housed his divine power, his legitimacy, his right to rule. To shear a Merovingian's head was to strip away his sanctity, to commit political heresy. Cutting the king's hair was the symbolic equivalent of ripping the very soul out of the state with a pair of scissors. This wasn't a superstition born from fashion. The tradition had roots that stretched deep into pre-Christian soil, from Druidic and pagan beliefs, later intertwined with Christian myth. The Merovingians were syncretic rulers, blending the old gods with the new gospel. They were said to have prophetic dreams, healing touch, and destinies shaped by divine will. Their people didn't merely obey them, they venerated them. One of the earliest and most significant of these kings was Clovis I in the year 496. He converted to Christianity, specifically Roman Christianity, and was baptized in Reims. Legend holds that at the moment of baptism, a dove descended from the heavens, bringing with it a vial of holy oil, a gift from God himself, anointing the king in a divine ritual that bound him not just to his people, but to the church. It's a dramatic story, but beyond the miracle, it marked a turning point, a quiet surrender of sorts. Clovis's baptism signaled a shift from the gods of the old world to the rising power of the Latin Church. Yet, even under this Christian mantle, there were older, stranger things stirring beneath the surface. According to later legends, Clovis's lineage was not entirely human. His supposed ancestor, Merovic, the dynasty's namesake, was said to have been born of a sea creature. Some say it was a bull-headed beast from the depths, others something closer to Neptune himself. On the face of it, this sounds absurd, but ancient mythology often wrapped symbolic truths in fantastical skins. Merovic's oceanic origin may have been a metaphor for a bloodline set apart, otherworldly, untouchable. This potent blend of myth and history gave the Merovingians a kind of authority no army could match. They weren't just kings, they were living relics, the embodiment of the sacred, which makes what happened to them all the more curious. By the time Dagobert II met his end, the Merovingians had already been stripped of much of their political clout. They still wore crowns, but the real power had shifted into the hands of the mayors, of the palace chief officials, who controlled the administration, the treasury, and the armies. These mayors were the hidden power, the smiling bureaucrats behind the curtain. The most notable among them was Pepin of Herstal. His descendants would eventually seize the throne outright, beginning with Pepin the Short, who deposed the last Merovingian king and founded the Carolingian dynasty. This transition wasn't a violent coup. It was a slow, calculated Faidan erasure, conducted not with swords, but with whispers and decrees. One by one, Merovingian kings were quietly retired to monasteries. Their sacred hair was cut, their titles revoked, their bloodline diluted into the background noise of history. And yet, why? If they were truly obsolete, why not destroy them completely? Why not execute them or exile them? Why tuck them away in cloisters, preserving their bodies while stripping their power? Some suggest that it was out of respect, a lingering reverence for their sacred status. Others think it was fear. And then there are those who believe the truth is far stranger, that the Church saw the Merovingians as rivals, not merely to political power, but to the very story of Christ. If the Merovingians truly believed they were descended from Jesus Christ through Mary Magdalene and a secret child, their existence would threaten more than a crown. It would threaten doctrine itself. Christianity's foundation rests on the idea of divine sacrifice, not divine succession. A Christ who left behind a bloodline is not a purely spiritual savior. He is a man whose legacy runs in flesh and blood. And a living bloodline would be living heresy. Heresy becomes far more dangerous when it walks, talks, and claims a throne. Adding to this murky picture is a little-known Merovingian practice known as divine vision. Surviving chronicles speak of kings who could see signs before battle, dream of events yet to come, or slip into sacred trances. One story tells of King Guntram healing a leper with nothing more than a kissing act that later earned him sainthood. Another claims that Dagobert II dreamed of his own assassination years before it happened. To skeptics, these are just hagiography's religious embellishments designed to polish royal reputations. But to others, they are fragments of a coded truth, preserved under the guise of miracle stories. This is where modern scholarship begins to fracture. Mainstream historians often see the Merovingians as just another dynasty mythologized in hindsight. But others, especially those working on the fringes, expect something more deliberate, a suppression engineered by church scribes to protect orthodoxy. Even today, the argument plays out in hushed conference corners and the footnotes of obscure journals. Did the Merovingians truly believe they were descended from Christ? Or was that belief planted in them, used to elevate them to power, and then erased once they had served their purpose? There is no proof, at least, not in the academic sense, but there are hints. Relics of hair preserved in monasteries, uncanny consistencies in legends scattered across France, suppressed gospels that speak of Magdalene in ways the official canon does not, shrines to her in places she should never have been. The truth may be gone, deliberately buried, but the silence is still speaking. Always the symbols, always the quiet markers, left like breadcrumbs for those patient enough, perhaps obsessed enough, to notice the bees, carved with a craftsman's precision into worn blocks of stone. The fleur-de-lis repeating in patterns that feel more ritual than decorative. The five-pointed stars, their edges softened by centuries of rain and wind, yet still unmistakable. They wait not for everyone, but for someone who will pause, look closer, and realize they were never mere ornamentation. They were signals, warnings, or perhaps invitations etched into the skin of history itself. When Dagobert II died, the silence that followed was not the kind that comes from politics alone. It was thicker, stranger, mythic. It was as if a curtain had been pulled, not only over a man's life, but over a mystery woven so tightly into the tapestry of his reign that removing him meant unraveling an entire thread of the kingdom's identity. That silence still clings. You can feel it if you know where to walk and how to listen. Wander through the ancient woods of the Ardennes, and you will notice it, that pregnant pause between each step, as though the earth itself holds its breath. Listen carefully, and the sound beneath your feet is more than just leaves and soilets, the muffled heartbeat of a story buried deep, layered under moss-covered crypts, beneath the bones of forgotten kings. A story still breathing, still waiting for the right moment to be told. Follow that silence, and you drift, almost unconsciously, into shadowed vaults of stone. Here, the air hums like an ancient hymn, one too old for words, vibrating with a resonance your body feels before your mind can name it. The Basilica of Saint Denis rises at the edge of Paris, not merely as a church, but as a colossal reliquary. It is a necropolis castle hybrid, part cathedral, part memory palace, a place where every echo seems deliberate. Nearly every king of France rests here, their reigns reduced to names chiseled in marble. Their crowns, once radiant symbols of power, now dulled and oxidized behind museum glass. And yet, under all the layers of pageantry and ritual, a whisper persists, a whisper that the official tours never mention. The tomb of Dagobert II is missing, or perhaps, more accurately, is not where it should be. That is not a minor detail. This is Saint Denis, after all, the sacred vault, obsessed with housing the bones of royalty, the ceremonial heart of French monarchy. Clovis rests here. So, to do the heirs of Charlemagne, their bones, like chess pieces, arranged with ceremonial precision. But not Dagobert II. Instead, in a twist that history itself seems to smirk at, his grandfather Dagobert I lies here with all the honors one might expect, carved inscriptions proclaiming eternal rest, the kind of monumental dignity befitting a king. But the murdered monarch, the one who vanished from the official chronicles, does not appear in the registry of saints, sovereigns, or sepulchres. His absence is not explained. It is simply unacknowledged. And yet, there are whispers. Whispers that flicker through monastic records, like candlelight through stained glass vent, colored and easily missed unless you know where to look. In the year 872, a monk named Hincmar of Reims claimed to have received a vision, divinely inspired, in which he was told that Dagobert II was no ordinary king, but a saint, martyred unjustly. The vision, Hincmar wrote, revealed that Dagobert's body lay far to the east, beneath a church in Stenay. The claim stirred enough curiosity to lead to the discovery of a tomb there. For a brief, improbable period, Dagobert II was locally venerated. As a saint, pilgrims came. His feast day was celebrated. A chapel rose in his honor. And then, just as the cult of Saint Dagobert began to take root, the story took a turn into the shadows. Veneration was quietly discouraged. References to his sainthood began to disappear. By the early 12th century, his name had been erased from the living memory of the Church, not denounced, not disproven, simply removed. So what lay beneath Stene? Accounts are frustratingly inconsistent, but they share certain strange details. Bones were found, yes, but not just one burial. The arrangement suggested an entire royal configuration: a king, a woman, and a child. No identities confirmed. No official records. Surviving wars, revolutions, and renovations have since treated those ancient tombs like inconvenient furniture, moving and dismantling them without ceremony. Yet rumors persist, not just of human remains, but of objects: a stone carved with an unfamiliar sigil, a reliquary box sealed with wax, bearing a crest no heraldry book now recognizes, and, in perhaps the most tantalizing account, a small vellum scroll inscribed with Hebrew characters. None of these findings were ever acknowledged in any public record, and those who probed too deeply, men like Father Saunier, whose name we will encounter again, often met strange fates: professional exile, sudden, unexplained wealth, or an abrupt end to their inquiries. One detail, obscure yet persistent, continues to nag historians like a pebble trapped in the shoe of scholarship. In 1653, a document surfaced in the Vatican archives known as the Chronicon Sionis. It described a hidden tomb not under the grand basilica we know today, but beneath an older, forgotten chamber containing the body of a king of divine descent, silenced by Rome, watched by bees. The phrase "watched by bees" has confounded researchers for centuries. Yes, the bee was a known Merovingian emblem, but by the 17th century it had been absent from French heraldry for nearly 1,000 years. Was it coincidence, forgery, or was it a breadcrumb planted for the few who would understand its significance? Some believe the Chronicon was pointing deliberately to a burial placed under the very heart of royal France, not to be celebrated, but to be hidden. This leads to an uncomfortable question. If such a tomb truly exists beneath Saint Denis, why has it never been unearthed? The French government has poured resources into restoring the basilica time and again. Archaeologists have mapped large portions of its substructure. Yet, beneath certain sealed sections of the crypt, excavation is strictly forbidden. Official statements cite structural instability. Too dangerous, they say. But when has danger ever stopped modern ambition? We rebuild cathedrals toppled by fire, drill oil from miles beneath the ocean, and repave roads over sites older than history itself. So why, in this case, does the ground remain untouched? Unless, of course, what lies beneath is not meant to see daylight. Even Napoleon's visits add fuel to the mystery. In 1806, the emperor toured Saint Denis, requesting to see the royal tombs. His aides reported that after a long private inspection, Napoleon made a curious remark: "Some kings leave no name, only a legacy of silence." The line appears in his later journals. Some historians dismiss it as poetic musing. Others suspect he may have been shown something the public never would be. And then there is the bee. After more than a millennium of absence, the bee reappears. In Napoleon's imperial regalium, broidered into robes, etched into seals, flown on banners. Officially, he claimed it represented industry and hard work. Yet others see it as a calculated signal, a quiet claim that he was heir not just to Rome, but to the oldest and most enigmatic bloodline of France. So we return, inevitably, to Dagobert. 2. A king erased, a saint unsainted, a tomb misplaced. His memory survives not in the pages of official chronicles, but in chapel inscriptions, half scrubbed away, in documents annotated with cryptic marginalia, in the stubborn persistence of conspiracy theories that refuse to be entirely silenced. His presence is felt most strongly, not in the facts recorded, but in the spaces where facts should be and are not, the gaps, the omissions, the silences. Modern scholars remain divided. For some, the missing tomb is a historical curiosity, but hardly meaningful. For others, it reeks of deliberate suppression, the quiet burial not only of a body, but of whatever truths that body carried. And then there is the most unsettling theory of all, that Dagobert II was interred with something too dangerous to reveal: a scroll, a gospel, a genealogy, an object capable of unraveling the delicate weave of Christian legitimacy, should it ever see the light. The safest course was neither to destroy nor display him, but to hide him deep beneath the stones of power. But bones do not keep secrets forever, especially when the land itself remembers. In the village of Stene, the wind carries strange stories. Locals speak of dreams, a tall man in a blue cloak, a queen whose lips never move, a boy holding a golden orb, standing silently in the chapel doorway. Whether these are fragments of history echoing through the centuries, or pure invention scarcely matters. Either way, the tomb is whispering. The question is, can you hear it? Now, picture this: a dim reading room in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The walls are paneled in mahogany, the air thick with the scent of old paper and ink. It is the kind of room where the scratch of a fountain pen feels louder than footsteps. In 1975, a man named Pierre Plantard steps into this room carrying a peculiar set of documents. He files them under an even stranger title, Dossiers Secrets de Henri le Bino. On the surface, these papers are eccentric, almost theatrical genealogical charts sprawling like ivy, obscure letters, and lists of supposed grand masters of a secret society called the Prieur de Sion. But beneath their tangled calligraphy lies a spark, one that once lit will leap from dusty archive shelves into the modern imagination, igniting the Grail mythos as we know it today. The claim is audacious, that the Merovingian bloodline did not die, but slipped underground, surviving in secrecy. That Dagobert II's son, Sigisbert IV, escaped the assassins sent for him, finding refuge in the Languedoc region of southern France, and that from there his descendants endured, guarded by an ancient brotherhood sworn to protect what they called the sacred bloodline of Christ. It is an extraordinary assertion, one that would sound absurd if not for the unsettling precision of certain details. Family trees naming obscure nobles, cross-referenced with records too obscure for casual forgery, correspondences hinting at alliances centuries in the making. It is here between the lines of these dossiers that the modern story of Dagobert II begins to merge with something far older, far more dangerous, and perhaps still alive. There were seals, ancient, weathered, and bearing symbols, iconography interlaced with names and figures that seemed plucked from the yellowed margins of real history. Among them, Bertrand de Blanchefort, the legendary Grand Master of the Knights Templar, a man whose life, according to these strange documents, was reinterpreted not as one of warfare and political maneuvering, but as a chapter in a much older, more clandestine mission. The mission was not conquest, but guardianship of a bloodline said to be older than the cathedrals and more dangerous than any sword. The dossier insisted that the Prieur de Sion had existed since at least the 11th century, though some suggest its origins stretch even further back into the mists of the early medieval world. It was presented not as a mere religious society or monastic brotherhood, but as the invisible hand behind Europe's most decisive turns of fate, a network devoted to protecting a lineage whose very existence, if revealed, could shatter the carefully built edifice of church and empire. Their supposed task, to safeguard the Grail, not the golden chalice of legend, but the sang real, the royal blood. It's at this point that a rational mind might tighten with skepticism, and that's fair. The Prieur de Sion has always been regarded as a historical curiosity wrapped in layers of myth and fabrication, with very little in the way of verifiable proof. Pierre Plantard, the man most responsible for bringing the society into modern attention, was eventually exposed for embellishment, perhaps even outright invention. Yet, here lies the paradox. While some portions of the dossier were indeed false, not all of it could be dismissed so easily. Certain genealogies, obscure and arcane, have been confirmed through independent historical research. Tombs, described only in these documents, were later uncovered exactly where the text had claimed they would be, and the list of supposed grand masters, Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo, reads so implausibly illustrious that it almost forces you into one of two positions. Either this was a clumsy hoax, or it was deliberate misdirection, concealing something far more grounded. Then there's the matter of timing. The dossier surfaced well before the so-called Grail craze took hold in popular imagination. It came before Holy Blood, Holy Grail, before Dan Brown's sprawling web of fiction, before tour guides whispered stories in the shadowed corners of Roslyn Chapel. If this were a hoax, it was unnervingly prescient, anticipating themes that would later dominate decades of pseudo-historical speculation. That alone demands pause. Among the more puzzling inclusions in the dossier was the Labino Mappa, seemingly harmless chart of the region around Rennes-le-Château. Harmless, except for the strange, almost invisible symbols sketched over certain ridgelines and valleys. Later, those symbols were found to correspond, though not perfectly, to peculiar geographical anomalous formations that had been the subject of local folklore for generations. In one striking example, a ridge marked with an 8-pointed star was discovered to align almost exactly with the foundations of a ruined Templar outpost. Coincidence, perhaps, but patterns have a way of taking root in the mind, whether they're born of truth or chance. Historians remain divided. Some dismiss the entire dossier as elaborate fantasia, historical puzzle box filled with invented keys. Others, more cautious, concede that while Plantard likely embroidered his narrative, he may have genuinely believed in its core assertions. His conviction was enough that under oath in a French court he declared himself a direct descendant of the Merovingians. The claim crumbled under legal scrutiny. Yet, curiously, the court did not pursue charges of fraud or perjury. The matter was simply dropped. No further public inquiry, no formal explanation, And so the question lingers, not merely whether the Prieur de Sion exists, but whether it even needs to. History is littered with noble families who guarded their bloodlines with almost pathological care, strategic marriages, hidden heirs, daughters cloistered away in convents until alliances demanded their return. None of that is unusual. What sets the Merovingian legend apart is the spiritual weight assigned to it. If the Church had reason, even faint reason, to believe these claims, the political consequences would have been catastrophic. A lineage descending directly from Jesus would reduce centuries of papal authority to rubble. The priesthood would no longer stand as mediator between humanity and the divine, because the mediator would be neither abstract nor celestial, but a living, breathing ruler. The Vatican archives themselves contain curious notes, some vague and dismissive, others redacted entirely, that reference heretical lines in France. Among them are mentions of families with unusual inheritance patterns, heirs appearing suddenly where none had been recorded, and marriages that defied political logic. The dossier takes this a step further, claiming that somewhere beneath the Pyrenees lies a Volta-sealed repository containing not only the complete Merovingian genealogy but also sacred relics, perhaps even the bones of Mary Magdalene herself. There is no proof, only the story. But stories, as history proves again and again, can be as enduring and as dangerous as fact. That story has been enough to drive decades of obsession. Treasure hunters, amateur historians, and secretive organizations have combed the hills and villages of southern France in search of it. Some discoveries are stranger than fiction. A mosaic in a crumbling church showing a red-haired woman holding a chalice, a long-forgotten painting of a king in sapphire robes surrounded by a cloud of bees, a nameless gravestone carved with only 3 words, in Latin sanguis non morita, blood does not die. Are these fragments part of a hidden pattern, or are they the mind's natural tendency to connect unconnected dots? The line between deliberate design and accidental alignment is razor-thin. Yet even among skeptics, there's a grudging acknowledgement. The idea of the Prieur de Sion has teeth. It has its own internal logic, its own vocabulary, and just enough scaffolding in documented history to be dangerous. Perhaps the dossier was never intended to prove anything. Perhaps it was an invitation of flair sent up into the dark, signaling that the cracks in the cathedral walls might be worth a closer look, that the empty spaces in royal registers and the names whispered in oral histories but absent from parchment might matter. Secrets rarely announce themselves with trumpets. More often they whisper, carried on parchment corners, in the absence of a tomb where one should be, or in a symbol carved into a lintel by a mason who died 7 centuries ago. Now imagine this, a weathered fortress at dawn, its turrets blurred by mist, its stones damp from a night of rain. Beneath its vaulted chambers, a circle of knights kneels in absolute silence. Their white mantles, stitched with a blood-red cross, ripple faintly in the draught. Before them lies an altar, and upon it 2 swords crossed, as though in benediction. To the casual observer, this might appear as mere ceremony, but to those who knew the inner purpose, it was something else entirely, a rite older than the fortress itself, a ritual of guardianship, an oath not to king or country, but to something far older and infinitely more dangerous, the bloodline they swore to protect. The Knights Templar, warrior, monks of the Holy Land, defenders of pilgrims, bankers to kings. Their rise was meteoric, their reach vast. Founded in 1119 to guard a single road into Jerusalem, they expanded into one of the most formidable powers in Christendom. The Pope blessed them, monarchs feared them. Within a century, their holdings stretched from Portugal to Palestine, fortresses, farms, fleets, and, most tantalizingly, vaults said to be filled not only with gold, but with secrets. The official history insists they protected pilgrims, fought in the Crusades, and served as the Church's holy enforcers, but alternate accounts dismissed by many as speculative nonsense tell a more troubling tale. According to these, the Templars' destiny was never about defending roads or financing wars. It was about what lay beneath Jerusalem. Soon after their founding, the Templars established their headquarters atop the Temple Mountain, the former Al-Aqsa Mosque. According to tradition, that ground rested upon the ruins of Solomon's Temple. Their presence there is explained as an honor, a practical base of operations. Yet almost immediately, they began to dig, quietly, methodically, for nearly a decade. They excavated beneath the mount. No records described the purpose. No construction projects were undertaken. They simply dug. And then, just as abruptly, they stopped. What had they been searching for? Theories abound. Some say the Ark of the Covenant. Others suggest scrolls containing early Christian rites or lost theological doctrines. But one of the more persistent incendiary claims is this, that they unearthed tangible proof of a sacred bloodline, not metaphorical. Not symbolic, names, dates, a genealogy stretching from the Gospels to living heirs tied directly to the Merovingians. If true, it would explain much. Upon their return to Europe, the Templars seemed transformed. Their wealth expanded exponentially. Their political influence deepened. They began constructing cathedrals and chapels whose architectural forms defied contemporary norms, structures infused with sacred geometry, circles and pentagrams, labyrinths and patterns, echoing constellations or Kabbalistic diagrams. Their internal rituals became increasingly arcane, their hierarchy impenetrable, and then came their downfall. By the early 14th century, they were simply too powerful, too wealthy, and too independent. King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt to the order, decided to act. On Friday, October 13, 1307, a date whose shadow lingers even now, he moved against them. Across France, Templars were arrested, their assets seized, their leaders tortured, until they confessed to grotesque charges, heresy, idol worship, obscene rites, even the worship of a mysterious, disembodied head. The accusations strain credibility, yet the efficiency of their destruction suggests a threat far greater than the king's unpaid debts. What, then, were they really protecting? And if they succeeded, that knowledge, relic, or bloodline was hidden away, is it now? Perhaps, as the Prior legend insists, it still waits beneath the mountains, in a vault that has not been opened in centuries, or perhaps it walks among us, unrecognized, its inheritance carried quietly through generations. And yet, under torture, many of the captured Knights Templar confess to something that still unsettles historians and theologians alike. It wasn't merely admissions of heresy in the conventional sense. These were confessions that spoke of knowledge too great for ordinary men, truths that, if believed, could have unraveled the very foundations of medieval Christendom. The Church, ever watchful for threats to its authority, feared these whispers, and yet it recorded them. One Templar, his voice breaking under pain, hinted at a bloodline, a lineage stretching far to the east, yet somehow still alive, still pulsing, here in the heart of Europe. Was this the fevered delusion of a man pushed past the limits of endurance? Or was it, in some fractured way, a shard of an older truth? Among the most obscure, yet strangely well-documented pieces of evidence, one stands apart: the so-called Chinon parchment, discovered in 2001 within the Vatican's own secret archives. The parchment revealed a stunning fact: that Pope Clement V had been secret, absolved the Templars of heresy even before their executions were carried out. This revelation raises more questions than it answers. If the highest authority in Christendom had already absolved them, why then allow their destruction to proceed in such a brutal, public fashion? Was it a matter of political necessity? Was it fear? Or was there some deeper guilt, perhaps a knowledge that they were being silenced, not for heresy, but for what they knew and protected? In the trial records, one curious and unsettling detail recurs: repeated references to a head. Sometimes it was called Baphomet, sometimes the head of wisdom. Scholars have quarreled endlessly over its meaning. Some view it as the symbol of an esoteric deity, an idol representing forbidden knowledge. Others suggest it was a preserved relic, skull, perhaps even a mummified head kept as a talisman. But there is a darker, more chilling theory: that this head was not symbolic at all, but the physical remains of a figure of immense significance, a person whose bloodline was too sacred to destroy, yet too dangerous to reveal. If such an object existed, it might have been the most carefully guarded secret of the order, hidden in vaults, carried across continents, shielded from prying eyes for generations. Here, inevitably, the path winds back to the Merovingians. Some versions of the legend insist the Templars were never merely defenders of pilgrims in the Holy Land. They were guardians, keepers of a lineage. Their true mission, according to these whispers, was not the defense of stone walls or sacred roots, but the preservation of descendants. Descendants born of the most controversial union imaginable, that of Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene. The saying real, the royal blood, in these accounts. One name emerges again and again: Dagobert II, a king, a Merovingian, whose life and death are shadowed by intrigue. For some, he represents the physical bridge between this sacred bloodline and the royal houses of Europe. If such a link existed, it would explain the Templars' extraordinary secrecy, their wealth, and their often baffling political influence. Some researchers go further still. They argue that the Templars did not lose their power at all after their official suppression in 1312. Instead, they simply shifted it, transferring their knowledge, symbols, and perhaps their mission into other, more discreet organizations: the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians. The web of secret societies that emerged in Europe over the centuries may, according to this theory, be nothing less than the Templars in another form. New names, new symbols, same purpose. Mainstream historians, speculation. The evidence, they remind us, is fragmentary, circumstantial, often reliant on later sources. And yet, the puzzle pieces, scattered as they are, seem to lock together with unnerving precision. Why did the Templars guard the Temple Mount so fiercely? Why did they dig beneath it in secret? Why were their initiation rites conducted in darkness, sealed in oaths of silence? And why most hauntingly did so many go willingly to their deaths, never betraying what it was they truly served? Perhaps they were more than protectors. Perhaps they were archivists, curators of a truth older than kingdoms. Or perhaps they were something more dangerous, usurpers. Because here lies the darker twist in the tale. Some believe the Templars did not merely guard the bloodline, they exploited it. They appropriated its legitimacy for their own ends, cloaking themselves in a divinity that was not theirs by birth, but by possession. The true heirs, if they existed, may have been hidden away, their claims suppressed, while others wielded their heritage as a weapon. Secrecy is a double-edged sword. What is hidden can indeed be protected, but what is hidden can also be stolen. And so the question remains. A question remains a question as sharp as a sword drawn in the dark. Were the Knights Templar the loyal defenders of a sacred truth, or the cunning stewards of a legacy they never truly owned? Close your eyes and you can almost hear it, the thud of stone doors closing, the echo of armored boots fading in a long torchlit corridor, the whisper of a banner caught in a draft, and somewhere deep beneath that silence, a heartbeat, the heartbeat of a secret that has never stopped beating. Imagine now a thread thin as silk, yet strong as fate stretching, from the sunlit hills of Galilee to the deep forests of Gaul. It weaves its way through deserts and catacombs, through cloisters and coronations, through whispered vows and blood-soaked battlefields. It is cut at a dozen points in history, yet always it is knotted, spliced, renewed. That thread is said to be the bloodline of Jesus Christ himself, carried, not in Scripture, but in the veins of living descendants. And if certain stories are to be believed, that thread wound its way directly into the life of Clovis I, the first Christian king of the Franks. This is no casual claim, it is a leap across centuries, and such leaps demand careful steps. So we walk slowly. The foundational claim begins here. Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene were not only companions in faith, but husband and wife. They had children. After the crucifixion, Mary, pregnant or with children, already fled the Holy Land. The legends say she traveled by sea, eventually reaching what is now southern France, in the marshlands of Provence, in a place still called Sainte Mary's de la Mer. The story takes root. Local traditions insist she did not come alone. With her, the tales say, were Lazarus, Martha, and a small company of followers. Whether history or hagiography, the region has never forgotten her. Chapels, shrines, and statues abound depicting her with flowing red hair, clutching a golden vessel. That vessel is often taken for the Holy Grail, but some suggest it is not a cup at all, but a symbol for something carried within the body, blood, and the life it contains. If these accounts hold even a kernel of truth, then her child or children grew up in this land. They married into local nobility, their identity concealed, their heritage whispered only in trusted ears. Over generations, the bloodline strengthened its position, moving quietly through the aristocracy, until by the time Rome's empire was crumbling, it had merged with the royal line of the Merovingian. And so we arrive at Clovis Aja, figure both brutal and brilliant, a warlord who united the fractious Frankish tribes under one banner. His baptism in 496 AD remains one of the most celebrated events in Catholic historiography. But Clovis' conversion was not ordinary. Unlike other kings who converted out of political necessity or after military defeat, Clovis' baptism was accompanied by a legend that a vial of holy oil carried by a dove from heaven was used to anoint him. The scent ampule, they called it. This was not just the ritual of a penitent sinner, it was the coronation of a chosen one. Why him? Why Clovis? Some whisper it was not merely his martial power or his readiness to align with Rome. It was something in his blood, a thread running back to a sacred origin. If the Merovingians truly descended from the union of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, then Clovis was not only a king, he was the living embodiment of that union, the bridge between divine authority and temporal power, the sword and the spirit in one man. Official history makes no such claim. The records name his parents as Childeric I, a pagan Frankish king, and Basina, a Thuringian queen. But when you examine the genealogies closely, gaps appear, missing years, vague maternal lines. Then there are the symbols, golden bees buried with Childeric, found centuries later in his tomb. Bees sacred to the Merovingians, representing resurrection, eternal life, and the right to rule. Napoleon, more than a millennium later, would adopt the bee as his own emblem, not to link himself to the later Carolingian dynasty, but to this older, more mysterious line. The claim, then, is this: the bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene did not vanish into legend. It flowed into the Merovingian dynasty, beginning with Merovic, embodied in Clovis, and carried on through their heirs, protected, hidden, but never destroyed. If this is true, then the earliest French monarchy was not merely sanctioned by the Church, it was descended from the very figure the Church worshipped. And that is precisely why the idea is so dangerous. For if such a descent were proven, it would undermine every monarchy, every papal claim to divine authority, every doctrine that bases salvation solely on faith rather than inheritance. It would transfer the center of spiritual gravity from altar to bloodline, from creed to chromosome. It begins with one of the great scholarly debates, a question that invites fascination, skepticism, and endless late-night discussions in dimly lit study halls. Can genealogy ever truly confirm such a claim? For most historians, the answer is a curt shake of the head. Records simply don't stretch back far enough to bridge the chasm of centuries. DNA evidence, when it exists, is tenuous, often too thin to survive the long shadow of time. Across hundreds of years, identities blur, surnames shift, and paper trails fade to nothing but dust and guesswork. And yet, there are cracks in this wall of doubt, subtle fissures where the light gets in. In certain corners of Europe, often the same regions whispered about in folklore, you find families whose documented ancestry stretches back far beyond what's typical. Families whose heraldic symbols echo motifs from medieval manuscripts. Families whose oral traditions carry whispers of origins far stranger than the peasant and warlord stories most of us inherit. Some modern researchers, particularly those behind controversial works like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, have chased these threads across maps and manuscripts. Their trails run through names that keep returning like persistent refrains in an ancient song: Dagobert II, Sigibert the Fortunate, the Plantard family, Blanfert, Gisor, and Rensselaer Todo. They are names that resurface like musical Notes in a fugue, repeating quietly beneath the louder melody of official history. Skeptics call it wishful thinking, a case of pattern recognition run wild, a human mind connecting dots simply because it wants them connected. Yet perhaps the truth is not about proof in the modern scientific sense. Perhaps it's about continuity, about a story so enduring that it weaves itself into bone and blood, surviving long after empires collapse and saints are forgotten. And here, a more personal question emerges. What would you do if you discovered your own family tree led not to farmers or fighters, but to a man said to have walked on water, and to the woman who stood at the foot of the cross? Would you guard that truth fiercely, building a dynasty upon it? Would you hide it so deeply that history itself could never find it? Or would you risk everything to tell the world? The word alone, Grail, is a summoning spell for the imagination. Instantly, the mind conjures a shimmering chalice, a knight kneeling in mist, a cup aglow in a shaft of holy sunlight. Perhaps it rests deep in a mosque-forward chapel in an Arthurian forest. We know the image so well that we rarely question it. The Grail, we say, is the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, the vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion, a relic of unimaginable power. But what if it isn't? What if the Grail was never a cup at all? Some have reimagined it entirely, not San Grail, the Holy Grail, but Sangreal, the royal blood. This is not a clever linguistic trick. It's a rupture in the accepted story. It shifts the focus away from relics and toward inheritance, away from an object and toward a lineage. At the heart of this interpretation lies a staggering possibility that the Grail is not a vessel that once held Christ's blood, but the bloodline itself, alive, hidden, and passed down through generations. The earliest Grail stories give us room for this idea. In the late 12th century, Chrétien de Troyes, the poet often credited with originating the Grail legend, describes a mysterious procession carrying a golden Grail, but offers no explanation for its meaning. It is not yet the cup of Christ. Only later, through writers like Robert de Boron and Wolfram von Eschenbach, does the Grail become explicitly linked to Christian relics. Even then, the details vary wildly. In some accounts, it's the cup from the Last Supper. In others, it catches the blood of Christ on the cross. In some versions, it grants healing. In others, immortality. And in still others, it grants nothing at all. That inconsistency is telling. The Grail never had a fixed identity. It was a cipher, a vessel, not only physically, but conceptually, waiting to be filled with meaning. So why not this meaning? Those who support the bloodline theory point out that the central challenge in Grail quests is rarely finding the cup, but understanding it. In story after story, the knight must be worthy of the Grail before it reveals itself. Purity of heart or nobility of lineage are often prerequisites. The implication is that the Grail's truth cannot be grasped by just anyone, only those of a certain blood. In this light, the Grail is less a relic than a secret, a hidden truth embedded in dynastic succession. And, intriguingly, many of the earliest Grail romances were written in regions steeped in Merovingian legends, southern France, Languedoc, and Occitania, the very places where traditions about Mary Magdalene's exile and survival of a holy bloodline took root. Coincidence? Possibly. But coincidences, like riddles, tend to multiply when ignored. Consider this. In several early Grail accounts, the Grail-bearer is a woman. In Wolfram's Parsifal, she is called Repance de Joy, a name suspiciously close to she who dispenses joy. She is not a warrior, nor a queen. She is a preserver, a carrier. In some tellings, she is even pregnant, the ultimate symbol of continuity. Could this be allegory? Could the Grail-bearer herself represent the protector of a bloodline, a Magdalene figure in disguise? The bloodline theory found modern momentum in the 1980s with Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which argued that the Grail legends were cover stories, elaborate myths built to preserve truths too dangerous for the Church to acknowledge openly. In this reading, the knights of Arthurian legend, Percival, Lancelot, Galahad, were symbolic echoes of real guardians, protectors of a sacred family tree. Predictably, traditional scholars reject the theory as speculative, pointing to the absence of direct proof. Yet absence is not proof of absence. In historical mysteries, sometimes the silence is the loudest evidence of all, and when we look through the lens of symbolism, the theory sharpens. In alchemy and mystical traditions, the cup represents the feminine principle, the vessel, the womb. To reinterpret the Grail as Mary Magdalene, or more precisely, as the sacred womb that bore Christ's child, is not only consistent with ancient symbology, but also explains why the legend has endured in such mutable forms. The quest, in this sense, becomes deeply personal and deeply subversive. It's not a hunt for a relic locked in stone. It's a search for origin, for continuity, for the truth of inheritance. It also reframes the Church's puzzling treatment of Mary Magdalene. For centuries, she was recast as a repentant prostitute, a slander with no biblical basis, while her role as witness to the resurrection, her closeness to Jesus, and her leadership among the disciples were diminished. Why go to such lengths to erase her? Unless she was more than an inconvenient woman in a man's story, unless she was the vessel of something that could append the entire theological order. If the Grail is a bloodline, it explains one of the great peculiarities of Grail stories. The Grail almost always disappears. In many versions, it is seen only briefly before vanishing forever. It is taken away, hidden, or revealed only to be removed again. A relic can be seized, enshrined, or destroyed, but a living bloodline is far harder to erase. And if the Church knew such a lineage existed, and that it lived outside their control, it would have been more than a theological inconvenience. It would have been a threat to the very foundation of their authority. Now, centuries of myth collapse into a single possibility. The Grail may not be found in a forest or a vault, but in the branching lines of a family tree. And perhaps that thread we imagined earlier, stretching from Galilee to Gaul, is not a romantic fiction at all. Perhaps its DNA, high in the foothills of the Pyrenees. The wind moves like a whisper through olive trees and over the ruins of crumbling stone. The air smells of sun-warmed earth and something else, the faint scent of secrets long buried. Here lies a village so small you could miss it entirely on a map, and yet it holds one of the most enduring enigmas of modern European history. Ren's fact and fiction are impossible to untangle here. At the center of its mystery is one man, Berenger Saunier, the 19th century priest, who, according to legend, stumbled upon something so explosive it could have shaken the Church to its foundations. When Saunier arrived in 1885, the village chapel was decaying, its congregation impoverished, and his presbytery barely fit for habitation. By all logic, the rest of his life should have been uneventful, a quiet series of sermons, funerals, and humble duties. But that is not what happened. But then, something changed. It didn't happen in a way anyone would have expected. There was no announcement, no sudden decree. Instead, it began quietly with the sound of hammers and chisels in the small hilltop village of Rennes. The priest, Berenger Saunière, had decided to renovate the humble church of St. Mary Magdalene. At first glance, it seemed a pious act, the sort of maintenance any parish might need after years of neglect. The roof leaked, the plaster had crumbled in places, and the altar had seen better days. But Saunière's renovations were anything but ordinary. He commissioned custom statues from Parisian artisans, not the modest sort you'd expect in a provincial chapel, but exquisitely detailed figures, rich in color and symbolism. He ordered stained glass windows of dazzling intricacy, their jewel-toned light spilling across the nave in shifting patterns that seemed almost alive. And then there was the altar, a strange, elaborate construction that puzzled anyone who looked closely. It was adorned not with the serene faces of saints or the gentle imagery of the Gospels, but with demons, skulls, and Latin phrases that were unsettling in a place of worship. One inscription read, "In hoc signo vinces," by this sign you will conquer. Another declared, "Terribilis est locus est," terrible is this place. A curious choice for a chapel supposedly dedicated to Mary Magdalene, whose story is one of repentance and grace. But here, the atmosphere was different, ominous, suggestive, as though Saunière was speaking not just to his parishioners, but to someone or something else entirely. And then came the money. For years, Saunière had been an impoverished rural priest. His stipend was barely enough to keep himself fed, let alone fund elaborate renovations. Yet now, almost overnight, he had access to substantial funds. Not a little, a fortune. He purchased land, commissioned architecture, and spent freely on rare books, fine wines, and imported luxuries. He built a tower, the Tour Magdala, to house his personal library, a structure whose name itself echoed the Magdalene connection. He constructed a sprawling villa, the Villa Bethany, and filled it with antiques and curiosities. Guests arrived from Paris and beyond, scholars, aristocrats, even individuals whispered to be spies. When asked where the money came from, Saunière offered only vague replies. Donations from well-wishers, he said. But the local records tell a different story. There were no large tithes, no recorded benefactors. The wealth seemed to appear out of thin air. According to one persistent version of events, the key lay in the renovation itself. While dismantling part of the altar, Saunière reportedly discovered a set of parchments hidden within a hollowed-out pillar. These documents, if they existed, were said to contain coded genealogies, references to a concealed bloodline, and cryptic messages encrypted in multiple layers of cipher. Some accounts claimed the name Dagobert II appeared in the text, the Merovingian king assassinated in 679, whose lineage was rumored by some to have survived in secret. Others claimed the parchments referenced a priory, a term that would later ignite endless speculation about hidden societies and guardianship of ancient truths. Whether these parchments were real or the invention of later storytellers remains one of the great questions of Rennes-le-Château. but the fact remains. After their supposed discovery, Saunier's life and fortune changed dramatically. He began making regular trips to Paris. His destinations were often obscure, certain libraries, the salons of influential but discreet individuals, and churches associated with esoteric strains of Catholicism. Chief among these was Saint Sulpice, long connected with mystical symbolism and sacred geometry. On his return, he brought with him books on alchemy, treatises on ancient symbols, and diagrams whose meaning was far from straightforward. And there was another pattern. Saunier seemed obsessed with controlling the land around his church. He purchased nearby plots, not to develop them, but to keep others away. On more than one occasion, he is said to have paid handsomely for property simply to prevent any digging in specific areas. Local gossip spoke of an old map allegedly found among his belongings, marked with crosses, stars, and strange geometrical shapes. When overlaid on the local landscape, these symbols corresponded uncannily with ancient megaliths and the ruins of Templar sites scattered through the region. The implication was tantalizing, that beneath the rolling hills and quiet fields lay something hidden, a chamber, a tomb, perhaps even the final resting place of Mary Magdalene herself, or, more dangerously still, proof that she had descendants who carried a sacred and potentially world-altering bloodline. To the skeptical, this was nothing more than fantasy. To others, it explained everything: the money, the secrecy, the symbols in the church. For Saunier's chapel was no longer an ordinary place of worship. It had become a riddle carved in wood and stone. The stations of the cross he commissioned were subtly, and sometimes overtly, irregular. Figures wore expressions that seemed to break the fourth wall, staring directly at the viewer. Traditional iconography was inverted. Symbols appeared where they should not be, and certain gestures, to the untrained eye, meaningless, aligned with known esoteric hand signs. Even the layout of the church itself hinted at deliberate design, proportions and alignments that some claimed matched star maps or sacred ratios. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the money stopped. In 1910, the church opened an investigation into Saunier's finances. He was accused of simony, the selling of masses for money. Saunier claimed he had conducted thousands of masses for the dead, sometimes dozens, or even hundreds, in a single day, a logistical impossibility. The investigation threatened to strip him of his post and even excommunicate him, but he refused to name the true source of his wealth. From that point on, he withdrew. In his final years, Saunier became reclusive, refusing the sacraments and keeping to his estate. He hoarded notebooks and correspondence, refusing to let anyone see them. In January 1917, he suffered a stroke. His confession, taken by a local priest, produced an unusual reaction. The confessor emerged pale, shaken, and according to later accounts, refused to grant Saunier absolution. Whatever was said in that confession, it died with both men. Saunier passed away later that year. His companion and housekeeper, Marie Denenade, inherited everything. She declined all offers to purchase the property, regardless of the sum offered. Some believed she was waiting for the right buyer. Others suspected she had sworn an oath to protect something. On her deathbed in 1953, she is said to have whispered, "The secret is so big, people would never believe it." And so, the mystery endured. Was Saunier merely a fraud, a con artist who fabricated a legend to disguise illicit schemes? Or did he stumble upon something buried deep beneath the church, something dangerous enough to explain the church's oddly cautious handling of the affair? For while the investigation into his finances was real, there is no record of formal prosecution. And in the months after his death, several high-ranking church officials visited the village without explanation. Some suspect the church's interest was less about Saunier's soul and more about whatever he might have uncovered or threatened to reveal. Perhaps the secret wasn't his to share. Or perhaps he never revealed it at all. Maybe it remains there still, somewhere under the stones, sealed away. And perhaps that's why people keep coming to Rennes-le Chateau. Not for the view, not for the art, but for something less tangible. The sensation as you step inside the chapel, that the air has paused, that the building itself is listening, that the walls carry a memory they will not speak aloud, that the Grail, if there ever was one, was never a chalice of gold, that it was a name. From here, our path leads to quieter corridors, spaces where the noise of speculation falls away, replaced by the hum of secrets catalogued and concealed. Imagine the Vatican not as the sweeping basilica we see on postcards, but as a vast subterranean archive, a labyrinth of climate-controlled vaults, locked cabinets, and shelves stacked with centuries of paper, vellum, and ink. Keys to certain rooms are known only to a handful of officials, and some drawers, it is said, have not been opened in generations. Here lie millions of documents, stretching back over 1,000 years. Most are routine theological treatises, letters, property records. Some are dangerous, heretical manuscripts, banned books, minutes from trials. And then there are the few, the smallest fraction, that are so sensitive they are not even listed in the catalogue. It is here, if anywhere, that the trail of the so-called bloodline begins to fade, not in a public scandal or fiery purge, but in the slow, deliberate art of erasure. The Church has always been skilled at managing memory. It rarely needs to destroy an idea outright. It simply buries it under layers of distraction, reframes it in less threatening terms, or quietly stops mentioning it at all. With their claims of divine sanction and their suspicious proximity to certain Gnostic ideas, posed just such a problem. Once the Merovingians had been praised by bishops, anointed with holy oil, and revered as rulers by the people of the Frankish kingdoms, but by the mid-8th century, their fortunes had turned. In 7, Pepin the Short, with papal blessing, deposed the last Merovingian king and founded the Carolingian dynasty. Curiously, this seismic political shift happened without war, rebellion, or public upheaval. It was as if the Merovingians had simply been retired. Why? One theory is that there was an unspoken bargain. Remove the problematic bloodline in exchange for Carolingian obedience to Rome. As part of that deal, the Merovingians' supposed divine heritage was to be erased from collective memory. Their sacred symbols were labeled as pagan trinkets. Their mystical rites were recast as mere superstition. And most effectively of all, official histories simply stopped talking about them. After Pepin's coronation, almost entirely ceased to mention the Merovingians, not in condemnation, but in absence, as though history itself had taken a breath and chosen not to exhale. And then, centuries later, a rare and obscure event, in 1244, during the brutal Albigensian crusade against the Cathars. A cache of documents was allegedly seized at Montségur. For centuries, rumors have swirled about a cache of texts hidden deep in the Pyrenees Mountains. Documents said to contain genealogical charts, apocryphal gospels, and something referenced only in whispers as the Linea Sacra Regalis, the sacred royal line. The story goes that these papers, weathered with age and sealed against prying eyes, were spirited away to Rome. They entered the labyrinth of the Vatican's holdings, and then they simply vanished. No inventory entry, no formal acknowledgement, no official index card in a drawer. The trail ends in silence. But in history, silence can speak volumes. Our next clue comes not from a conspiracy theorist, but from one of the most celebrated polymaths of the 17th century, the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher. Kircher was famous for his work on ancient languages, obscure symbols, and secret alphabets. In one brief, puzzling note buried in his correspondence, he describes a manuscript unlike any other, sealed in a copper box, written in an unsettling fusion of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He never names it outright, but instead calls it sanguine veritatis, the blood of truth. His words are chilling. He claims the manuscript undermines the foundations of dogma with lineage and names too ancient to refute, and then nothing. He never mentions it again in any surviving letter, journal, or record. Scholars have debated whether this was simply Kircher's penchant for dramatic metaphor. After all, he often blurred the line between literal and poetic. But if sanguine veritatis was real, if such a document truly sat within the Vatican's vaults, then its contents would explain the obsessive secrecy surrounding certain collections. The Vatican's secret archives, officially renamed in recent years to sound less ominous, remain among the most carefully guarded repositories on Earth. Only a handful of researchers are admitted each year, and entry alone isn't enough. You must already know exactly what you want to see. You can't browse shelves, wander aisles, or hope for serendipity. There's no section marked uncomfortable truths or forgotten bloodlines. No handwritten label pointing to aisle 12. It's a system designed to eliminate accidental discoveries, to lock away anything that could connect the present to a past the Church might prefer left in shadow. This brings us to a long-running and polarizing scholarly question. Is the Vatican concealing evidence of the Merovingian, or, as some alternate traditions call them, the Merovingian bloodline? Most mainstream historians dismiss the notion outright. The archives are vast, yes, but also meticulously catalogued. Still, history teaches us a sobering truth. The Church has erased before. Entire Gospels were excluded from the canon at the Council of Nicaea. Doctrines were redacted, saints struck from calendars, entire traditions sidelined. The Inquisition oversaw the burning of libraries. Even in the modern era, we've seen precedent. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, were under tight control for decades, studied only by a small circle of scholars, chosen, in part, with ecclesiastical approval. Suppression is not merely possible, it is precedent. Consider the Gospel of Mary, a Gnostic text unearthed in the 19th century after centuries of burial in Egypt's sands. In its pages, Mary Magdalene emerges not as a marginal figure, but as a teacher, a confidant, perhaps even a spiritual heir to Christ's wisdom. And yet, this gospel never entered the canonical New Testament. It languished in obscurity, deliberately excluded. Why? Because it presents continuity, legacy, and leadership that did not flow through Peter, the rock upon which the Church's authority rests, but through Magdalene herself. Now link that to the Merovingian claims, a bloodline stemming from Mary Magdalene, guarded by noble houses, hunted, or at the very least suppressed by the Church. The pattern begins to take shape. A strange footnote deepens the intrigue. In 1957, Father Gianni, a Vatican librarian, gave his only recorded interview. When asked about the gaps in Merovingian-era records, he offered a single, cryptic statement. Some truths are not lost, they are withheld to protect what should never be questioned. And with that, he said no more. Sometimes erasure does not look like burning pages. Sometimes it looks like preservation under lock and key, rooms with no windows, drawers with no labels, doors whose keys have been misplaced for centuries. Somewhere, deep within the Vatican's hush, one imagines a copper box, sealed, untouched, waiting for no one. Now, shift your vision. Let your eyes adjust to the warm candlelight of a Renaissance studio. Dust dances in golden sunbeams. The sharp, resinous scent of linseed oil saturates the air. Canvases lean against every wall, some finished, others frozen mid-stroke, their half-formed figures holding silent counsel. In the center of it all, bent over a slab of wood, sits Leonardo da Vinci. His gaze is a rare alloy, part divine mischief, part geometric obsession. Leonardo, artist, engineer, anatomist, dreamer, and if certain theories are true, custodian of a bloodline secret. The most controversial link in this tangled web is the suggestion that Da Vinci encoded references to the Holy Bloodline, and specifically the Magdalene lineage, into his works. Chief among these is the Last Supper, painted between 1495 and 1498 on the refectory wall of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan. The scene is balanced, almost mathematically composed. The emotions are vivid, yet the overall frame remains oddly still, almost staged for inspection. But controversy swirls not over what is there, but who. To Jesus's right, our left, as viewers, sits a figure of delicate build, flowing auburn hair, smooth cheeks, and no beard. Tradition labels this as John the Apostle. Yet for centuries, some have whispered another possibility. Mary Magdalene. The face is soft, almost serene, hands clasped in repose rather than alarm. The head tilts toward Christ, mirroring his lean away. Together they form a negative space, a distinct chalice-shaped V. To some, this is no accident, but an intentional symbol of the Grail, not an object, but a person. This idea exploded into mainstream culture through the Da Vinci Code, but its roots predate Dan Brown by decades. Earlier theorists had pointed out not only the feminine form, but the union of symmetry, geometry, and symbolism in Leonardo's composition. Every line, every gesture, every angle seems deliberate. In 2003, digital analysis deepened the mystery. When the Last Supper was mirrored and overlaid against itself, certain patterns emerged. Gaze matching gaze, gesture meeting gesture, forming at the center a faint, star-like pattern. Was this pure chance? Or was Leonardo embedding a mirrored duality, male and female, Christ and Magdalene, into the very fabric of the piece. His fascination with symmetry and sacred proportion is well documented. He filled his notebooks with mirrored writing. He encoded musical harmonies into visual works. He dissected human bodies not just to map flesh, but to explore metaphysical parallels. He didn't merely illustrate theology, he encrypted it. The pattern repeats in his Virgin of the Rocks. There are two versions, one in the Louvre, another in London's National Gallery. Both feature Mary, the infant Jesus, the infant John the Baptist, and an angel in a rocky grotto. But subtle differences emerge. A hand placed here rather than there, an expression altered, a gesture that shifts from maternal to almost priestly. The grotto itself is womb-like, a natural cathedral of stone and shadow. Some see in the two versions the echo of dual truths, one public, one private, one for the church, one for the initiated. Then there are the hidden forms, anatomical shapes in drapery, the faint outline of a heart or even a fetus woven into folds of fabric. Leonardo's paintings seem to hum with layered meanings, visible only to those who know the code. His associations deepen suspicion. He moved among patrons tied to esoteric circles. He illustrated parts of the Codex Atlanticus, which, alongside sketches of flying machines, contains strange maps, astrological diagrams, and symbols resonant with early Templar manuscripts. And so the theory forms: Leonardo da Vinci as painter, yes, but also as archivist of a counter-narrative. A narrative in which the Holy Grail is not a chalice, but a bloodline, in which the Church deliberately eclipsed the feminine aspect of the divine, in which Mary Magdalene, not Peter, was Christ's chosen successor, in which her descendants, perhaps the Merovingians, are the living Grail. Traditional scholars reject this outright, but the evidence, while circumstantial, remains stubbornly persistent. They point, often with an air of confident dismissal, to the lack of primary evidence. They note the absence of a signed confession from Leonardo, the inconsistency in interpretations over the centuries, the human tendency, and into our very biology, to find patterns where none were intended, to connect dots that may not have been placed for us at all. These are valid critiques, undeniably so. Any responsible historian or art critic must acknowledge them. But consider, for a moment, the timing. Leonardo painted the Last Supper in the closing years of the 15th century Europe, still trembling under the weight of ecclesiastical authority. This was an era when heresy was not merely frowned upon, it was punished with imprisonment. Ideas deemed dangerous to the orthodoxy could not be spoken aloud without risking everything. And so if such ideas were to be preserved, they would have to be hidden, not declared openly, but embedded quietly, encoded in a language of form and color, visible only to those trained to see it, a painted riddle for minds attuned to its frequency. When you remember, too, that Leonardo's patrons were often political adversaries of Rome men with ambitions that ran counter to the Vatican's authority, the possibility becomes sharper. In such company, an artist might feel not only the freedom, but the motivation to conceal ideas that could never be spoken. Could he have embedded a secret, one preserved not in ink or parchment, but in visual language passed down like a cipher, through geometry, through proportion, through deliberate absence? And if so, who was meant to decode it? Was it a message for his contemporaries, whispered across centuries in the guise of a mural? Or was it intended for an audience not yet born, a generation distant enough to interpret it without fear? Which leads us to a question still debated today in academic circles and fringe histories alike. Did Leonardo da Vinci truly believe in the so-called bloodline mytha idea that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were wed, that they had descendants, and that their lineage continued into the present? Or did he simply find the symbolism compelling, a rich source of narrative and artistic potential? Was he transmitting a truth he had learned, or shaping a story of his own invention? Some scholars suggest that he drew no sharp line between truth and invention at all, that, for Leonardo, art, science, religion, and mystery were not separate disciplines but interwoven strands of the same braid. That to him the search for meaning was not about dogma, but about recognizing patterns found not in sermons, but in symmetry, in the natural harmonies of the world. What we can say with certainty is that Leonardo left behind no children to carry his name, no personal memoir to explain his intentions, and no overt statement of theology. What he left instead was a body of work that resists simplicity, a corpus that glows, almost defiantly, with questions. Here was a man obsessed with anatomy, who mapped the musculature of the body with the same reverence others reserved for scripture, and who painted hearts into halos, as though the divine and the biological were one. A man who understood blood, movement, its mystery, perhaps even its legacy. And so, the next time you stand before the Last Supper, let your eyes soften. See not a cup, but a space. Not 12 men flanking a Messiah, but a pair, a symmetry, a secret. And in that sliver of negative space between them where no hand touches, yet everything connects, you may glimpse not a vessel on a table, but the very shape of the Grail. Now, let us shift the lens. Imagine history not as a straightforward chain of events, but as a stage. Curtains rise and fall. Costumes change. The actors step into the light, deliver their lines, and then vanish into the wings. But behind the velvet curtains, the script itself is rewritten quietly, deliberately, by men whose names are often forgotten, though their decisions still ripple outward across centuries. One of the boldest rewrites in the history of Europe was not announced with fanfare. It did not take the form of a bloody coup or a thunderous revolution. It was quieter, more surgical, the replacement of one mystical dynasty with another, more compliant one. The Merovingians erased, the Carolingians installed, and with them a sacred bloodline traded for a more obedient brand of king. The year is 751. The Frankish kingdom is vast in territory, but fraying in cohesion. The Merovingian monarch, Childeric III, sits on the throne in name only. His hair, once a potent symbol of royal authority in Frankish tradition, is still long, but it has become ceremonial rather than sacred. Real power now lies elsewhere. That power is in the hands of Pepin, the short mayor of the Palais Royal, that had begun as a managerial office for court affairs, but had over time eclipsed the king's authority entirely. Pepin is short in stature, but expansive in ambition. He is strategic, charismatic, and, most importantly, well connected to Rome. According to Frankish annals, Pepin dispatched envoys to Pope Zachary with a calculated question: should the man who holds the power not also be the king? For Zachary, beset by threats from the Lombards, and desperately in need of a strong, secular ally. The question was not a riddle, but an opportunity. His reply was as subtle as it was seismic. Yes, the throne should be held by the one who rules. The message was unambiguous. Childeric III was deposed, not executed, not sent into exile, but quietly placed in a monastery. His sacred hair was shorn, stripping him of the symbolic power of his ancestors. His reign ended not with a sword, but with scissors and silence. In his place, Pepin was crowned not merely by local bishops, but by the Pope himself. The ceremony was heavy with choreography, sacred oil, solemn chants, oaths exchanged under the gaze of the Church. In that moment, the Carolingian dynasty was born, and with it, a new alignment between crown and cross. But this was not merely a change of leadership. The Carolingians did not just replace the Merovingians, they rewrote them. Chronicles were revised, genealogies were altered. Kings once celebrated for visions and miracles were rebranded as indolent, ineffective, or corrupt. It was as though a stagehand had pulled a lever and dropped a new backdrop into place. And here lies a curious fact. There was no war, no mass uprising, no public unrest. A dynasty that had ruled for centuries simply disappeared with barely a murmur from the populace. Such a clean transition hints at more than political inevitability, suggests preparation, consensus, or perhaps manipulation. This opens the door to a darker interpretation that the fall of the Merovingians was not the organic result of political decay, but the carefully orchestrated concealment of a threat. A threat not to the stability of the realm, but to the ideological architecture of the Church itself. The Merovingians claimed a divine bloodline. Their authority did not depend on papal endorsement. They did not require the blessing of Rome to legitimize their rule. Their claim came from birth, from ancient myth, from a sacred origin story that, if tied to Christ himself, would be catastrophic for the Church's hierarchical order. The Church's power was and still is built on apostolic succession, an unbroken chain of spiritual authority passed down from the apostles to bishops, to popes, each link sanctified by the one before it. The Merovingian claim represented something entirely different, a line of inheritance based not on office, but on blood. Blood was harder to control, and so the trade was made: apostolic succession in exchange for genealogical silence. The Carolingians, practical to the core, accepted the deal. Pepin secured the crown. Rome neutralized a dynasty that had no need of its blessing. Pepin's son, Charlemagne, would go even further. Under his reign, the Carolingian court became a fortress of Christian orthodoxy and imperial theology. Scripture was standardized, heresy hunted down, and church and state fused in a way that elevated clerical power to heights unseen before. But within this reformation was an absence, a quiet, deliberate absence. The Merovingians were not vilified so much as they were erased. Saints once celebrated under their patronage faded from veneration. Monasteries they had founded were dissolved or restructured. Even their burial sites, once places of pilgrimage, were neglected into obscurity. It was not a death, it was an archiving. And yet some traces endured. In the Liber Historia Francorum, an early 8th century chronicle, the Merovingians are described as from ancient stock, chosen by God. Later editions, produced under Carolingian oversight, omit the phrase entirely. Likewise, Saint Dagobert, too, whose cult had flourished in eastern France, was quietly desainted, not condemned, not anathematized, simply forgotten. This soft erasure poses an unsettling question. If the Merovingians were merely ineffective rulers, why go to such lengths to erase them from memory? The answer, some argue, lies not in politics, but in symbolism. Imagine, if you will, a living descendant of Christ walking the halls of Europe, not seeking a throne, perhaps, but still carrying a claim beyond dispute. Such a person would challenge every bishop, every pope, every carefully constructed doctrine. It would shift the foundations of faith from theology to genealogy, from creed to chromosome. In this reading, the Carolingian coup was not about replacing a dynasty, was about replacing a myth, the myth of sacred blood. The dangerous idea that divine power could be passed down through flesh and bone rather than through the laying on of hands. But myths, as history repeatedly shows, are hard to kill. Legends persisted whispered in cloisters, murmured in marketplaces, that Sigisbert IV, son of Dagobert II, survived the assassination of his father, that he escaped south to the region of Septimania, that under the protection of local nobility he married, had children, and that his bloodline did not die, but merely diluted, hidden in plain sight among Europe's aristocracy. In this telling, the Carolingians were not true heirs, but caretakers, holding the throne while the rightful line lived on in silence. And so, the scholarly debate continues, fought not only in the pages of history books, but in the minds of those who still believe that somewhere in the tangled roots of European genealogy runs a thread of blood that began in the streets of Galilee. In the half-light of early colonial America, history is written not only in books, but in the very stones and timbers that have endured the centuries. Many of these relics sit in plain view, unnoticed by those who pass them daily. They are woven into the landscape, into town greens, quiet churchyards, and overgrown woodlots, waiting for eyes trained to read their language. Among them are artifacts and alignments that, at first glance, seem mundane, yet, upon closer examination, begin to whisper of older traditions, older journeys, and perhaps older truths than the ones we have been taught. It is a story that unfolds slowly, like an old map unrolling under careful hands. You begin to see patterns in places where most see only coincidence. A weathered stone with marks that seem deliberate rather than random. The orientation of a building that resists the grid of surrounding streets. The strange survival of symbols that should, by rights, have been lost to time. The record of human history is rarely complete, and the spaces between the accepted chapters can be wide. Into those spaces, speculation creeps, sometimes wild, sometimes reasonable, always hungry for the missing pieces. Some researchers believe that these missing pieces might point toward a presence in North America long before Columbus won, not of Vikings, nor wandering monks, but of a more secretive and controversial order. Their clues are scattered, found in unlikely corners, a medieval-style tower in a New England town, a carved stone in the woods of Minnesota, weather-worn gravestones bearing symbols that seem to reach back far beyond the Puritan faith of their owners. And as they follow these threads, they find themselves drawn into a tapestry of ideas involving sacred geometry, ancient navigation, and a network of families whose influence may have reached across oceans. The trail begins with stone always, the stone. Unlike parchment, it resists the decay of time. Unlike memory, it does not forget. In churchyards across New England, gravestones carved in the 17th and 18th centuries stand in neat rows. At first, they seem simply functional, names, dates, brief epitaphs. But here and there, among the winged skulls and cherubs, you see something, stranger marks, whose origins seem out of place, crosses of peculiar design, interlaced patterns that call to mind medieval churches rather than frontier settlements, compass roses carved with unusual precision, as if the stonecutter had studied not merely ornament, but the mathematics of navigation. The question arises, did these early settlers know what they were preserving when they passed down these patterns? Or were they simply following a tradition they inherited without full understanding, like a family recipe repeated through generations without knowing why certain ingredients matter? Whether they knew or not, the result is the same. The symbols endured. They survived the crossing of the Atlantic and the upheaval of migration, embedding themselves in a new land far from their original context. In this theory, these symbols are more than decorative flourishes. They are a language, encoded and concealed. Proponents suggest they connect to what has been called Venus families, European bloodlines who, it is claimed, preserved certain astronomical and navigational knowledge. The idea rests on patterns of alignment stone markers, graves, and buildings positioned with reference to the movements of Venus in the sky. Over time, these alignments form an invisible grid, a geometry imposed upon the land, with certain points corresponding to key sites. A peculiar stone tower in Rhode Island, a carved knight in Massachusetts, the outlines of settlements in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia, in particular, becomes a focal point in this web of conjecture. To most, it is a place of fishing villages and rocky shores, but to some, it is a repository of secrets. The Oak Island mystery alone has fueled centuries of speculation, with its hidden shafts, cryptic stones, and whispers of buried treasure. Some researchers weave Oak Island into the same narrative as the other clues, seeing it not as an isolated curiosity, but as one more piece of a transatlantic puzzle. They imagine Templar ships slipping into secluded harbors here, offloading not gold or jewels, but manuscripts, relics, and encoded knowledge, safe from the storms of European politics. And here, the Newport Tower stands as a strange and stubborn witness, rising in a public park in Newport, Rhode Island. It looks like no other colonial structure in the region. Local legend has attributed it to everything from Viking explorers to 17th century windmill builders, but its proportions, arches, and masonry seem to some eyes more reminiscent of medieval architecture, possibly even linked to the style of round churches built by the Knights Templar. If that link were ever proven, it would be a seismic shock to the accepted history of North America. Yet proof remains elusive, and the tower stands mute and enigmatic as it has for centuries. Across the landscape, other sites echo the same peculiar mixture of familiarity and strangeness. In Westford, Massachusetts, there is the faint outline of a figure carved into a ledge of rock, called by some the Westford Knight. Weather and time have blurred its details, but enthusiasts see the image of a medieval knight, complete with sword and shield. If genuine, It would suggest the presence of Europeans in the region long before the English colonies. Skeptics counter that the carving could be a much later work, or even an accidental pattern in the stone. As with so many of these clues, interpretation depends on what you bring to it: a belief in hidden history, or a trust in established timelines. Sacred geometry runs through this entire theory like a thread of gold through cloth. The idea is that these sites, from towers to gravestones, are not randomly placed but intentionally aligned with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, and the cycles of Venus. To those who subscribe to this view, the landscape becomes a vast, open-air manuscript written not in ink, but in the placement of stones and structures. The knowledge required to create such alignments would have been significant, demanding not only skill in surveying and construction, but also generations of careful astronomical observation. And then there is Roslin Chapel in Scotland, a world away from New England, yet often drawn into the same narrative. Its intricate carvings include depictions of plants like maize and aloe vera, which are native to the Americas and were supposedly unknown in Europe before Columbus. If these carvings are authentic representations, they suggest a transatlantic connection centuries earlier than accepted history allows. The Sinclair family, patrons of Roslin Chapel, are sometimes linked to the Templars in legend, and some believe they could have played a role in voyages to the New World, carrying with them the knowledge and symbols that later appeared in North America. The most radical version of this theory imagines a quiet migration, a transfer not of armies, but of ideas and families slipping into the fabric of early colonial settlements. Templar survivors, or those carrying on their traditions, arriving under the cover of other identities, blending into the French colonial population, into fishing villages, into merchant communities. Their presence would not be announced with banners and trumpets, but hinted at in the layout of a town, the carving of a headstone, the orientation of a chapel. Over generations, their descendants might not even know the full truth of their heritage, yet the patterns they maintained would survive. For mainstream historians, such ideas are often dismissed as romantic fantasy or conspiracy theory. The lack of definitive physical evidence, dated inscriptions, documented voyages, keeps these claims on the fringe. And yet, the allure persists. Partly, it is the human instinct to fill gaps in the record with stories, and partly, it is the undeniable fact that history is not as complete or as tidy as we might wish. Every so often, an archaeological find overturns decades of certainty. Every so often, a forgotten manuscript or artifact surfaces to rewrite a chapter. It is not impossible that such a revelation could one day shed light on these lingering mysteries. Until then, those who seek the traces of a hidden Templar presence in America continue their search. They walk through cemeteries with notebooks and cameras, measuring angles, noting symbols. They stand before the Newport Tower at dawn, watching the first light of day filter through its arches, searching for alignments that might link it to the heavens. They compare the carving of the Westford Knight to effigies in old European churches. They trace lines on maps, connecting points that to others seem unrelated. And slowly, piece by piece, they build their case not in the halls of academia, but in the quiet persistence of independent research. The story that emerges is less about treasure in the conventional sense, and more about the survival of knowledge. If these clues are genuine, they hint at a deliberate effort to safeguard ideas, symbols, and perhaps even sacred relics across centuries and continents. And if they are not genuine, then they are a testament to the power of human imagination, to our deep need to find meaning in patterns, and to connect ourselves to something larger than the present moment. Either way, the stones remain silent and enduring, watching the centuries pass, holding their secrets. And in that silence lies the possibility, however slim, that the history of the New World is far older and far stranger than we have yet dared to imagine. The Romani people move in a slow, spiraling rhythm, their feet pressing the earth as if coaxing memory out of the soil itself. The music rises, mournful and insistent, drums and tambourines marking time, while hands reach upward as though calling down the blessing of Saint Sarah, the so-called Black Madonna, her image, weathered and darkened by centuries of devotion, looks on from the small chapel, her gaze both gentle and impenetrable. According to tradition, she arrived here long ago, with a mysterious trio of women from the Holy Land, bearing secrets and sorrow, their garments stained with salt from the sea. It is tempting to dismiss such traditions as nothing more than the embroidery of folklore, romantic story stitched onto the plain cloth of history. And yet, these stories have left traces not so easily explained away. They have etched themselves into landscapes, into stone and ritual, into the architecture of belief itself. A short journey from these shores brings you to the fortified town of Saint Maximin la Sainte-Baume, whose massive basilica houses relics that have drawn pilgrims for generations. Inside, the air is thick with candle smoke and the scent of incense, as if time itself has slowed to match the steady rhythm of prayer. Here, within a gilded reliquary, rests what the faithful believe to be the skull of Mary Magdalene. It was discovered, so the story goes, by monks in the 13th century, entombed in an ancient sarcophagus deep beneath the church. The skull, its contours delicate yet unyielding, still holds wisps of red hair, fragile as cobwebs, but defiant in their survival. DNA testing has never been permitted, whether from reverence, fear, or something else altogether, but the Church has authenticated the relic through its own means. Stand in that crypt for long enough, surrounded by the hush of stone, and you may feel the faint hum of something beneath the sanctioned version of events, like a truth hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be spoken. From here, the path turns upward into the Provencal Mountains, where an ancient cave waits in perpetual shadow. This is La Sainte-Baume, the Holy Grotto, a pilgrimage site since at least the 5th century. Tradition holds that Mary Magdalene withdrew here after arriving in France, spending the last 3 decades of her life in contemplative seclusion. They say her tears carved rivulets into the rock, her prayers settling into the very air, sanctifying it so deeply that even now, stepping inside feels like stepping into another realm. Pilgrims still walk the forest trail to reach it, some barefoot in reverence, their steps deliberate, their breathing slowed, as though matching the heartbeat of the earth. Why have these legends endured for so many centuries, appearing in so many forms and across so many cultures, if they were mere inventions? Skeptics argue that the stories took shape in the Middle Ages, crafted to attract pilgrims and, with them, economic prosperity. Such motives were hardly rare in a Europe crisscrossed by holy routes and reliquary shrines. Yet some details refuse to fit neatly into that explanation. In certain Merovingian-era chapels of southern France built centuries before the Church officially elevated Mary Magdalene's status, she is depicted not as the penitent sinner of later doctrine, but as a regal figure, robed in blue, bearing a vessel, and sometimes shown beside a child. Why would such imagery exist so long before her recasting in official theology? And why do noble genealogies in the same regions preserve claims of descent, not from kings or emperors, but from her? These whispers feed the most controversial thread in the tapestry, the theory that Mary Magdalene arrived in France, carrying more than spiritual devotion, that she was with child, that the life she sheltered within her was of direct descent from Jesus himself, and that, over generations, her lineage blended quietly into the fabric of Southern nobility, protected with both reverence and strategic discretion. In this telling, her descendants became stewards of Gnostic wisdom, guardians of sacred truths, and perhaps even the seed of the Merovingian dynasty. Mainstream historians dismiss the notion as unsupported conjecture, noting the absence of contemporary written evidence. But absence, in certain contexts, can feel suspiciously like erasure. Why is there no tomb in the Holy Land? Why no reference to her later life in the writings of early church fathers who were otherwise meticulous in documenting the acts and martyrdoms of saints? The silence is almost too absolute, as though a deliberate hand had smoothed over the page. Perhaps her story migrated from the realm of Scripture into the shadows of secrecy, from the public gospel to a guarded bloodline. Over time, what some scholars call the Magdalene cult faced suppression. By the Middle Ages, she had been recast as a repentant prostituta, characterization entirely absent from the Gospels, yet potent in its ability to strip her of authority, to render her harmless to a patriarchal hierarchy. The image stuck, cemented by sermons and paintings, until it became almost inseparable from her name. And yet she endured. She became patroness of perfume makers, of contemplatives, of those who live misunderstood. Artists painted her in crimson or emerald robes, her alabaster jar in hand, sometimes at the foot of the cross, sometimes alone in a wilderness of stone. In more esoteric works, she holds a book or a scroll, or appears with a child, a quiet suggestion that her legacy was not solely one of mourning, but of inheritance. In small Provençal villages, families still tell stories passed from grandmother to granddaughter, stories never committed to paper. Tales of a red-haired woman with a voice like warm honey, of a boy who bore her eyes, of a lineage kept alive, not with armies, but with silence. Memory wrapped in myth, or myth wrapped in memory. No longer matters which came first. The story lives, and so the question lingers in the air. Was Mary Magdalene merely a disciple and saint, a symbol of penitence, shaped to fit the needs of later centuries? Or was she something more, matriarch, mother, perhaps even the living vessel of the Grail itself? If the latter is true, then her bloodline did not vanish in Galilee. It took root in the limestone hills of southern France and may yet flow in veins today. Imagine now that you are walking through a crumbling stone corridor, your only light the wavering glow of a torch. Shadows shift across moss-cloaked walls, and the air carries the weight of centuries, cool, damp, tinged with the metallic bite of iron and the deep musk of earth. You are beneath the Temple Mount, or perhaps beneath the ruins of a forgotten priory. Or perhaps you are beneath the surface of your own imagination. But wherever this is, one legend refuses to die: the treasure of the Knights Templar. Not a mere hoard of gold and jewels, but a collection of relics and scrolls, said to contain a truth so volatile it could rewrite the story of Christianity. The notion of a lost Templar treasure is no idle fantasy. It has roots in recorded history. In 1307, when King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of the Templars, he expected to seize their wealth in one swift blow. His men stormed the Paris Temple, the order's headquarters, armed with warrants, maps, and accountants ready to tally the spoils. But the vaults were empty. No gold, no sacred relics, no documents of power. The absence was as loud as a shout. Had the Templars moved their treasures in anticipation of betrayal? Did they ever keep them in Paris at all? Some believe the order had long before smuggled their greatest holdings out of the Holy Land, perhaps even from the Temple of Solomon itself, spiriting them away through a network of hidden routes and guarded vaults known only to the initiated. These were said to be protected by cryptic carvings, encoded maps, and symbols scattered like breadcrumbs across Europe. And among the whispered contents of this treasure was something far more potent than gold: gospel, a genealogy, perhaps the very proof of the holy bloodline. If such documents existed, they would not merely challenge doctrine, they would detonate it, shifting the axis of religious authority away from Rome and toward the living heirs of that blood. Rewind the clock to the Templars' years in Jerusalem. Ostensibly a military order guarding pilgrims, they spent nearly a decade excavating beneath the Temple Mount under the guise of construction. Some accounts often dismissed, yet never wholly disproven, claim they unearthed ancient scrolls in forgotten languages, artifacts fashioned from metals unknown to medieval Europe, and perhaps even the remains of figures long venerated in secret traditions. Among these finds, the most incendiary of all would have been records detailing the lineage of Jesus, a family tree hidden for centuries. Such a discovery would have transformed the Templars into something far beyond warrior monks. It would have given them leverage against both crown and church, a safeguard and a weapon in one. The trail of the treasure, as told in countless retellings, winds through France. Some place it at Rensleu Chateau, the hilltop village where parish priest Berenger Saunière inexplicably acquired immense wealth after reportedly finding coded parchments during renovations. Others say it was hidden in Gisors, where secret tunnels and hollowed trees form a lattice of rumor and half-truths. Still others point to the Château de Blanchefort. Wherever it was taken, if it was ever moved at all, one fact remains: it has never been found. Or, as some insist, it has never been allowed to be found. For perhaps the treasure was never a pile of glittering coins in the first place. Perhaps gold was a metaphor for knowledge, for the kind of truth that shifts empires. A treasure you could not spend, but which could change the course of history in a single revelation. If that knowledge truly touched upon the Merovingian bloodline descendants, some dared to whisper, of Christ himself, then its implications would tower over any material treasure. Gold could be counted, spent, lost, but the proof of such a lineage would rewrite history, dethrone empires, and fracture the very foundation of the faith as it had been taught for centuries. It is in this light that we must turn to a peculiar obscurity. From the middle of the 20th century, the so-called parchment of Blois-Montfort, said to have been discovered in 1952. On its surface, it appeared to be little more than a medieval Latin text, a curious fragment referencing, with infuriating vagueness, a Templar treasure hidden beneath a Mount of Peace, or Mont de Paix in the old tongue. But to those who looked closer, its words were not what they seemed. Embedded within its cramped lines were anomalous phrases that defied grammatical sense, letters reversed, numbers scattered, and entire acrostics that hinted at a deeper code. None of these matched any known cipher system of the time, as if it had been designed not to be cracked by ordinary cryptography, but to provoke recognition only in those already inducted into its mysteries. One phrase emerged like a voice in the dark. "The guardian will sleep no more." Who or what was this guardian? Interpretations diverged wildly. Some saw it as a literal human descendant one, who, after centuries of concealment, would rise to reclaim their heritage. Others believed it to mean the revival of a society thought extinct, a priorate, perhaps, still tasked with safeguarding the bloodline. Either way, the phrase resonated with an unshakable sense of forewarning, as though a long-awaited moment was drawing near. Then there was Arnaud de Ville, a 14th-century alchemist whose reputation was already steeped in whispers of Templar allegiance. In one of his surviving letters, cryptic to the point of maddening, he writes of a vessel, not of clay nor gold, but of lineage, sealed for 13 generations. Was this a poetic flourish or a deliberate clue? The timing is troubling. Count back 13 generations from King Dagobert II, and you arrive squarely in the late Middle Ages, precisely when rumors of hidden heirs began to bubble through noble circles. It may be coincidence, but in this tapestry of symbols, even coincidence begins to look suspicious. From there, the trail winds westward, across the mountains, and into Portugal, where the Templars found a second life. After their suppression in France, they were reborn in secrecy as the Order of Christ, same brotherhood, same symbols, only a different name. Under this new guise, they built monasteries that bristled with esoteric imagery, octagonal towers recalling the dome of the rock, crosses with rounded arms, carvings of lilies and bees, and spirals that seemed to hint at eternity. At Tomar, the order's headquarters, the central rotunda mirrors the proportions of the Temple of Solomon. Scholars argue over whether these places were meant as fortresses of stone or fortresses of knowledge. For those who believe the latter, Tomar's rotunda was no mere chaplet, was a vault for something too dangerous to leave in open hands. Far to the north, in Scotland, another strand of the legend takes root. According to certain accounts, a fleet of Templar ships slipped away from La Rochelle under cover of night, evading the king's net, and steered into the cold seas. They landed in Argyll, where sympathetic clans gave them shelter. What they carried was not merely arms or coin. Some say it was sacred. A century later, the Sinclair family, whose connections to both Norse and Crusader bloodlines are well documented, built Roslin Chapel, a structure whose carvings have confounded historians ever since. Among its stonework, depictions of plants native to the Americas, carved decades before Columbus set sail, angels cradling bagpipes, and, once again, the motif of bees. Beneath the chapel lie sealed vaults, untouched for centuries, barred from excavation. What they contain is anyone's guess. The debate over the Templar treasure remains one of the most polarizing in historical scholarship. To skeptics, it is myth compounded upon myth, a medieval game of telephone whose distortions have become indistinguishable from the truth. To others, the persistence of the symbols, the geographical precision of the legends, and the recurring alignment of sacred architecture with astronomical events is too exact to dismiss. If it is a fabrication, it is one of the most coordinated in human history, and perhaps the most unsettling possibility of all is that the treasure was never meant to be found. Perhaps its value lay in the idea of belief that somewhere, beyond the reach of kings and popes, the truth still survived, not in gold, but in blood, not in a chalice, but in a legacy. And if that legacy was indeed the Grail, then the Templars' final sin was not in possessing it, but in protecting it. For in the wrong hands, truth can be more lethal than any blade. From here, the trail runs into fire, not the flickering, intimate glow of a hidden candle, but the searing, city-leveling blaze of holy war. The Albigensian Crusade was no distant campaign against foreign faiths. It was an inferno turned inward, Christian against Christian. Officially, it was a war against heresy. Unofficially, it may have been a war against knowledge, a purge aimed at extinguishing not only a doctrine, but possibly a bloodline. The targets were the Cathars, a sect that flourished in the Languedoc during the 12th and early 13th centuries. They preached a form of dualism in which the universe was split between a benevolent spiritual God and a malevolent creator of the material world. To them, the flesh was a prison and salvation a release from it. They rejected Rome's sacraments, shunned cathedrals, and lived with a simplicity so radical it embarrassed the luxury of their accusers. Their perfects, both men and women, lived lives of discipline and purity that rivaled and in some cases surpassed the ideals of the early church. But there were darker rumors that the Cathars held relics or records of a sacred lineage, that they revered Mary Magdalene as more than a saint, that they saw her as the mother of something enduring, that they honored not the cross of execution, but the blood of life. Even their sacrament, the consolamentum, was said to derive from something older than Rome, more intimate, perhaps a survival of Gnostic rites, thought long extinct. Some claimed they were custodians of texts smuggled west after the fall of Jerusalem, possibly even Gospels that had never been sanctioned. Such beliefs, if they were real, would have been incendiary. And so, in 1209, Pope Innocent III launched a crusade, not across deserts, but into the heart of Christendom. At Béziers, when the papal legate Arnaud Amalric was asked how to distinguish heretic from faithful, he is said to have answered, "Kill them all. God will know his own." 20,000 men, women, and children were massacred that day, and Catholics alike guilty of nothing more than proximity to forbidden thought. The slaughter continued for decades. In Iten-Lambaye-Sichersith, at Montségur, the last Cathar fortress fell after a brutal siege. More than 200 perfects were burned alive in a single pyre. And yet, days before the end, a small group is said to have escaped down the sheer cliffs, carrying with them something the victors could not be allowed to claim. No chronicle records what it was. To some, it was a treasure of gold. To others, a relic of inestimable spiritual value. to the most persistent of the Grail theorists. It was proof, a gospel, a genealogy, or even the preserved remains of one whose blood carried the most dangerous secret in Christendom. The Church's campaign against the Cathars is now recognized by many as a form of cultural annihilation, an erasure of not only people but of their language, art, and memory. Yet the silence was never complete. In the villages of Languedoc, fragments endured in folk songs, in weather-worn carvings no outsider could read, in the quiet persistence of bee motifs and grail-shaped baptismal fonts, and always in the unusual reverence for Mary Magdalene. That long predated her eventual rehabilitation by Rome, and here the geography becomes unsettling. The very valleys and hill forts targeted by the Crusaders are the same ones tied in later legends to the flight of Merovingian heirs. Septimania, the Rosas, the Pyrenea foothills all echo with both Cathar tragedy and whispers of the Bloodline's survival. Whether this overlap is mere accident or the trace of something older, the possibility remains that the Cathars were not only heretics in the eyes of the Church, but custodians of a legacy too dangerous to name. Think about it: a heretical sect that rejected the authority of Rome, that dared to step outside the boundaries of what was considered acceptable faith, that embraced the idea of the feminine divine and placed it at the very heart of their beliefs. A sect that operated in the same rugged, sun-bleached regions where stories of ancient bloodlines had taken root and flourished for centuries. Not merely a religious community, but, if some interpretations are to be believed, a living repository of a secret so dangerous that its very existence challenged the foundation of the Church's power. These were the Cathars, and the threat they posed was not just theological, it was existential. It was the kind of threat you do not debate with, you burn it out. And so they were eradicated with fire and steel. One controversial but compelling interpretation suggests that the Cathars may have been more than accidental neighbors to these bloodline myths, that they were not simply dissenters with an alternative reading of Scripture, but guardians of a truth, protectors of a lineage, that their theology was, in fact, inseparable from genealogy. They saw Jesus not as a distant, untouchable deity suspended in the heavens, but as a man, a founder of a human bloodline destined to carry his essence forward through the generations. And in their telling, Mary Magdalene was not simply a follower, nor even just a favored companion. She was the vessel, the one chosen not only to receive his message, but to carry his seed and ensure that his line continued in flesh and blood. Historians argue endlessly over whether this interpretation is fantasy or hidden truth. Many insist there is no surviving proof, no documents, no clear record that the Cathars believed anything of the sort. But then again, what proof would you expect to remain after such a deliberate and violent purge? Their writings were consigned to the flames, their rituals erased from living memory, their teachers hunted, their communities dismantled brick by brick. What survived were whispers, rumors that drifted from survivor to survivor, from village to village, until they became ghostly traces, symbols carved in secret, songs sung in code, rituals stripped of their overt meaning but still pulsing with the heartbeat of something ancient. And yet, even in that enforced silence, something remains. It lingers in the ruins of Laracy Abbey, where weathered stones still hold the coolness of shadow. it hums in the broken battlements of Montsegur, a fortress that became their last stand and their funeral pyre. It breathes in the olive groves outside Rennes-le-Château, to be forgotten. You can feel it if you stand still enough, the echo of something not quite gone, not entirely erased. It is not evidence in the academic sense. It is atmosphere. And yet, for those attuned to such things, it is as persuasive as any parchment. Even today, pilgrims walk the Cathar Trail. They follow narrow paths etched into the spines of mountains, tracing the same routes the Cathars themselves once took to reach their remote sanctuaries. They stop at caves said to contain relics, bones of martyrs, fragments of ancient scrolls, perhaps something more. Few speak openly about what they believe those caves hold, but the thought persists that they shelter more than just the memory of suffering. They may hold the memory of a bloodline itself, a living chain of flesh that once carried on may still carry the essence of Christ. So was the Albigensian Crusade merely a reaction to theological heresy, a brutal but straightforward enforcement of orthodoxy? Or was it something deeper, darker, smokescreen for a scorched earth campaign intended to annihilate the last protectors of a secret too ancient and too dangerous to name, a truth that bound blood to spirit, woman to Messiah, and earth itself to the divine? If so, then the flames that consumed Béziers and Montségur were aimed not at burning bodies, but at severing a lineage. But blood is not easily erased. It leaves traces. It stains memory. It sinks into the earth. And sometimes, despite the most determined efforts of kings and popes, it rises again. Fire may destroy parchment, but it cannot destroy DNA, and memory, like certain seeds, can lie dormant for centuries, only to awaken when the conditions are right. Now, imagine a door. In fact, imagine several heavy iron gates mounted on ancient hinges, guarded not by soldiers but by the frozen stone faces of saints who have watched for centuries without blinking. Behind them lies one of the most mysterious collections of documents on the planet, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. For centuries, it was called the Secret Archive, not, the Vatican insists, because of any nefarious secrecy, but because secretum in Latin means private. Still, the aura remains. Private can be another word for hidden, and hidden things tend to attract curiosity. Deep within its climate-controlled vaults, past glass cases locked with tiny keys, past row after row of catalogued Latin manuscripts, some believe the greatest cover-up in history is filed away in perfect monastic silence. Not gold, not jewels, not relics, paper, records, knowledge. If the bloodline of Christ truly existed, if Mary Magdalene bore his child, and if that line survived the centuries, then this, many believe, is where the evidence would be stored. Here, in the very heart of the institution whose authority would be most endangered by such knowledge. To walk the corridors of the Vatican Archive is to walk through time itself. More than 50 miles of shelving, stacked with documents that reach back over 1,000 years. Everything from the papal bull that excommunicated Martin Luther to the trial records of the Knights Templar is stored here. Yet each year only a handful of scholars are granted entry. Requests must be precise, approved in advance, and even then the visitor is guided, watched, restricted. You do not browse here. You are allowed to see only what you are permitted to see. and yet the gaps are as intriguing as the contents. Entire stretches of papal correspondence have vanished, particularly in periods where, if the bloodline story is true, the stakes would have been highest. Letters from the reign of Pope Zachary, for instance, disappear right around the time he sanctioned the deposition of the last Merovingian king. Why would a matter of such historical magnitude leave no surviving trace? Then there is Pope Sylvester, too, a scholar and mathematician whose contemporaries whispered that he had acquired forbidden knowledge, possibly during travels to Islamic Spain, possibly even further afield. Some claimed that what he found was not a foreign invention, but something buried in the early records of the Church itself. Whatever it was, it unsettled him enough to seed legends that his tomb would rattle whenever a corrupt pope took office. Superstition, yes, but superstition has a way of clinging to a grain of truth. In modern times, only a few insiders have spoken openly, or at least suggestively, about what might lie within those shelves. One was the late Jesuit priest, Malachi Martin, who hinted that the Church had long known of a bloodline. He never named names, never produced proof, but claimed the knowledge was buried for the safety of souls and the stability of the faith. Dismissible, perhaps, but then consider what the Vatican has chosen to withhold. For centuries, the official narrative was that the Church played no direct role in the fall of the Merovingians, merely offering its blessing when the Carolingians rose in their place. Yet, scattered medieval references suggest otherwise: shadowy councils, private agreements, quiet interventions designed to ensure the Merovingians' extinction. If those records still exist, the archive is the most likely place they would be. And if the bloodline had protectors, the fabled Priory of Sion, for example, then the Vatican would have been both enemy and infiltrator. There are stories of priests, monks, and scribes within the Church who secretly served this hidden order, encoding and preserving the truth even as others sought to erase it. In such a shadow war, the archive would be both fortress and battlefield, knowledge locked behind knowledge, secrets stored within secrets. And then there is the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's infamous list of banned books. Some titles were condemned for heresy in their theology, others, more quietly, for heresy in their history books that dared to suggest Jesus married, that he fathered children, that Mary Magdalene was his partner in every sense of the word. Many of these works were not destroyed but confiscated, hidden away in the Vatican's vaults. Were they kept for study or for suppression? No one knows. Rumors swirl endlessly that original, unedited transcripts of the Templar trials are stored here, that fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly those that challenge official doctrine, were quietly acquired and locked away, that somewhere in the archive is a chamber containing a single genealogical record, handwritten and continuously updated, tracing an unbroken line from Jesus and Mary Magdalene to a living descendant. Imagine that: a single document capable of reshaping the world's religious landscape overnight. Such a thing would dismantle centuries of theology. It would shift the axis of spiritual authority from creed to blood, from belief to biology, which is precisely why, if it exists, it must remain hidden. The Vatican, of course, denies all of it. The archive is not secret, they say, merely private. The rumors of suppressed gospels, bloodline charts, and forbidden histories are just that, rumors. but their denials feel strangely practiced, as if the real danger is not the truth itself, but the idea that it might be found. For faith thrives on mystery but evidence. Evidence changes everything. And so the gates remain closed. The rooms remain cold and quiet, and every year a few more scholars pass through them, some hunting for academic knowledge, others, perhaps, for something far more personal, because somewhere in those miles of parchment, ink, and dust, the thin line between religion and blood may exist only as a sealed folder, waiting for the day someone dares to open it. Now turn your gaze away from the hushed corridors of the archive. Look instead to the polished thrones, the velvet robes, the gold-threaded crests of modern royalty. Monarchies may seem like ceremonial ghosts from a bygone era, but they still stand. Some reign in name only, others wield influence more quietly than any parliament. And under the pageantry lies a question that almost no one will ask aloud. Could any of today's royal houses still carry the blood of Christ? It is a claim whispered in corridors, dismissed in polite company, and occasionally shouted by those who have nothing to lose, that the Merovingian line never truly died, that its descendants walk among us still, crowned and uncrowned, in palaces and in ordinary homes. That it wasn't extinguished, but instead dissolved quietly into other families, married off, hidden in plain sight, cultivated with care over centuries. It was not merely preserved, it was deliberately placed. The story begins with one stubborn, verifiable fact. The modern royal houses of Europe are tangled together in a dense web of intermarriage. Dynasties like the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, and the Windsors share roots that stretch back not just centuries, but more than a millennium. This much is unquestioned history. But if you trace those roots far enough, deep into the thicket of ancient lineages, some genealogists claim you can find old branches still alive, quiet, twisted, and closer to the present than anyone might expect. The Habsburgs are a prime example. Once emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, they intermarried with French and German nobles, whose own pedigrees wound back to the Carolingians. But the Carolingians themselves only rose after displacing the Merovingians, officially ending that earlier line. Yet ending here is a slippery word. Some noble lines tied to Merovingian kings, especially through the female line, didn't vanish. They were absorbed, folded invisibly into other families. And therein lies the loophole. Formal royal records have always favored male succession. But if the Merovingians truly carried some sacred, extraordinary blood, even the legendary blood of Christ, it could just as easily have survived through daughters, granddaughters, marriages that slipped into the annals without fanfare. These women, barely named in chronicles, may have passed their heritage onward in silence until their descendants appeared centuries later under entirely different titles. Certain family trees from southern France, once Merovingian territory, still show uninterrupted noble descent, reaching back to the early Middle Ages. Names like Dagobert, Claire, and Theodoric recur, though they're far from common in modern naming. Are they quaint tributes, or something more deliberate? This leads to the work of modern researchers, controversial, often dismissed outright. One of the most famous examples comes from the much-debated Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which argued that certain southern French aristocrats, particularly the Counts of Rosas, and the lords of Rennes descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene through the Merovingians. The authors tied this to the house of Plantard, a French noble family that Pierre Plantard himself claimed was the bloodline's guardian. His assertions were later riddled with proven forgeries, contradictions, and embellishments, yet even so, some suspect that beneath the layers of invention lies a core of truth. Multiple, independent genealogical studies show that countless European royals today, through their shared descent from Charlemagne, could plausibly connect their ancestry to early Frankish kings, and thus, in theory, to the Merovingian. Even Queen Elizabeth II, through her descent from Alfred the Great and the House of Wessex, was claimed by some to have indirect links to early continental nobility. Her Germanic ties via the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha twist back into the tight web of Europe's elite, where even the faintest surviving Merovingian thread could still run. From here, the theory gets more speculative and more contentious. Some argue that the survival of monarchies, especially constitutional ones, is itself a quiet homage to sacred legitimacy. In this view, certain symbols are not just decorative, but are coded reminders, fleur-de-lis, solar crosses, and heraldic devices that whisper of ancient lineage. In Scandinavian heraldry, symbols emerge that echo old Merovingian imagery. In Spain, relics linked to Mary Magdalene are still venerated, ostensibly for Catholic reasons, perhaps, but maybe for reasons even older. In Belgium, whose monarchy was only created in the 19th century, rumors suggest that ancient blood flows behind the official history. Mainstream historians, of course, remain deeply skeptical. Without DNA evidence, no such claims can be proven. Royal genealogy is notoriously unreliable, stuffed with apocryphal links, forged documents, and assumptions rooted in political marriages rather than biological fact. Wars, reforms, revolutions, and shifting alliances have fragmented Europe's noble lines into a chaos of tangled branches. Yet the mystery persists because it fits a pattern. Power doesn't always survive through open conquest. Sometimes it endures through continuity, through names carried forward, through sons named for long-dead kings, through bloodlines that remember what history tries to erase. Beyond the crowns and courts, there are also families who never sought power but claimed descent from Christ. In rural France, Switzerland, and Italy, ivy-covered stone houses stand whose owners keep meticulous family records, genealogies penned in Latin, rolled in cloth, stored in drawers, never shown to outsiders. These people aren't after influence. They are after preservation. It's as if the bloodline, once scattered, decided to wait rather than to rule. This brings the question that divides scholars and amateurs alike. If the bloodline did survive, what would it mean? Would it confer divine authority or spiritual leadership? Or would it simply be an inconvenient truth, one capable of destabilizing centuries of doctrine? There is no definitive answer, only scattered hints. A ring handed down through centuries, a crest with an unusual emblem, a name preserved on parchment, long faded, but still legible, Clovis, Dagobert, Sarah. Somewhere, perhaps even today, someone might walk through a garden unaware, or very aware, of the weight carried in their veins, of a lineage older than kingdoms and heavier than crowns. The central question is not whether such a bloodline exists, but whether it still matters, or whether, somewhere in some quiet house, it is simply waiting. And then the scene changes. You find yourself under vaulted ceilings again. But the air is different, scented with incense and faint tobacco smoke instead of mildew. Velvet drapes hang heavy, carved oak chairs sit in rows, aprons embroidered with half-familiar symbols rest folded on tables. The setting is strange, yet oddly recognizable, a Masonic lodge. And again the whispers return, whispers of a bloodline, of a secret too potent to live in daylight. Could the Freemasons, enigmatic architects of so much of the modern world, hold fragments of the Merovingian legacy? It is easy to dismiss Masonic lore as elaborate theater, men in sashes enacting obscure rituals with swords, candles, and phrases steeped in secrecy. But the Freemasons have always been more than a gentleman's club. They have drawn kings, scientists, artists, and revolutionaries into their fold. And their symbols, speak louder than their mottos. One in particular appears again and again, the beehive. In Masonic tradition, it stands for industry, harmony, and collective work. But to anyone following the Merovingian trail, it means something more. Bees were the emblem of the Merovingians, buried with their kings, etched into their tombs, painted in the margins of manuscripts, and briefly revived by Napoleon Bonaparte, who many believe was attempting to link himself to that same bloodline through his use of symbology. So when you step into a Masonic hall and see a beehive placed between the all-seeing eye and the twin pillars, the question comes unbidden: coincidence or continuity? The Freemasons trace their mythical origins back to the builders of Solomon's Temple, the same site the Knights Templar famously excavated during their time in Jerusalem. In Masonic lore, the figure of Hiram Abiff, master builder of the temple, is martyred for his sacred knowledge, an echo, some say, of Christ himself. But what if that legend is more than allegory? What if, buried in its metaphors, it carries fragments of the bloodline story, passed on not through scripture but through ritual? Ritual, after all, is memory wearing a costume. Consider this: within Masonic initiations, there exists a drama and intimate theater of symbols where death is not an ending but a prelude, and rebirth is more than metaphor. The initiate does not simply join a fraternity. He steps into an allegorical tomb, lies in symbolic darkness, and rises again into light. Passwords are whispered like fragments of a forgotten tongue. Hands meet in grips whose patterns are older than the modern nations they inhabit. Stories of resurrection are enacted, not merely the moral resurrections of a repentant man, but ritual reenactments that some believe echo a deeper truth, one drawn from a lineage that claims to predate church and crown alike. In this reading, every initiated Mason is not just a brother, but a vessel, carrying forward a legacy whose true meaning is veiled even to many within the order. The Scottish Rite, especially in its higher degrees, is a treasury of such esoteric imagery. Take the Rose-Croix degree, for example. Here, the candidate undergoes a ritual death, falling at the hands of persecutors before rising once again, not in the name of Christ, but in the image of a divine king whose story has been largely erased from the mainstream canon. Certain versions of the ritual even reject the orthodox interpretation of the crucifixion entirely. This is not the Jesus of the pulpit, nailed alone to a cross, but a figure whose bloodline, some claim, was preserved. In this telling, the divine did not end in tragedy, but continued quietly through descendants. Masonic lectures often seem designed to frustrate the casual seeker. They speak in riddles, the lost word, the true architect, the royal secret. When approached from the perspective of sacred genealogy, these phrases begin to hum with a strange resonance. What if the lost word was never a word at all, but a name that carried with it a line of descent, a name that, if spoken aloud, would challenge the entire edifice of religious authority? The Church, especially the Catholic Church, has long recognized something dangerous in Freemasonry. Its condemnation has been unwavering, branding the craft heretical and decreeing excommunication for those who persist in its membership. The stated reason is that the Masons value reason above dogma, that they stand outside the Church's spiritual jurisdiction. But there is another theory, whispered by some, that the Church's opposition was born not of theological rivalry, but of the fear that the Masons were custodians of stories. The Vatican had spent centuries suppressing stories that, if believed, could shift the axis of spiritual authority away from Rome forever. Recall that many of America's founding fathers, Washington, Franklin, Hancock, were Masons. They left fingerprints in stone and street. The capital city itself sits on a carefully chosen hill, its streets woven into star-shaped patterns. Obelisks rise like the stone needles of ancient pharaohs. Pentagrams and owls hide in plain sight, worked into the city's architecture. Bees cluster in carvings, like heralds of a forgotten kingdom. Were these mere decorative flourishes, or the unconscious continuation of something far older than the Republic? Albert Pike, 19th-century Mason, Confederate general, and author of Morals and Dogma, wrote of the ancient mysteries, secret wisdom, preserved in initiatic societies across millennia. Though Pike never mentions the Merovingians by name, his writings contain repeated allusions to kings whose claim to rule came not from conquest or coronation, but from a sacrificial destiny, from the belief that they carried divinity in their blood. Such men, he wrote, were often hunted to extinction by those who feared them. There are legends, too, of the 9 unknown Menon esoteric brotherhood, said to have been founded by India's emperor, Ashoka, to protect dangerous truths from misuse. Some within Masonic circles speculate that fragments of their guardianship survived in lodge traditions. Others whisper of the Priory of Sion, the alleged protectors of the Merovingian line, who may have hidden themselves among the Masons under assumed identities. The most tantalizing possibility is that certain Freemasons were never meant to lead at all, but to conceal, to bury truths in allegory until such a time as the world was prepared to understand them. Even the twin pillars Boaz and Jachin standing at the threshold of Solomon's temple may conceal more than they reveal. Perhaps they are not only the gateway to a biblical sanctuary, but markers of a different threshold, one that leads to a story no longer told aloud. Mainstream historians dismiss such theories. Masonic scholars will assure you that their symbols are moral metaphors, not genealogical ciphers. And yet, their arguments solid, though they may seem often, leave a curious hollowness in the air, as though they are omitting a chapter they cannot or dare not discuss. Because here is the problem. If the Merovingian line did survive, and if it found its way into the inner fabric of cultural institutions, it would not announce itself in history books. It would not be declared from pulpits or stamped into royal decrees. It would live in silence in the private language of lodges, in rituals whose meanings are opaque to outsiders, in stories traded by torchlight, in rooms that smell of dust and candle wax. So the question arises, when a Mason raises his eyes to the heavens and speaks of the great architect of the universe, is he invoking God, or is he naming a legacy, a structure not of stone but of blood? Picture this, a brittle scroll, tightly rolled and sealed in wax, discovered in a crumbling chapel tucked deep in the Pyrenea foothills. The parchment crackles as it is unfurled, its ink faded but still legible. The markings are strange, more symbols than words: a star, a path, a cross, and finally, a name. Now imagine it is not alone. Across France, Italy, and even the Scottish Highlands, other fragments surfacing dusty libraries, in the archives of forgotten estates, in the private collections of families who no longer recall how their ancestors came to possess them. On their own, they are meaningless. Together, they form a whisper, a suggestion of a map, not a chart for navigation, but for revelation. One such artifact is the Libono document, an obscure map brought to light in the late 20th century, and said to be part of the dossier's secrets, those same controversial parchments linked to the Priory of Sion and deposited, curiously, in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The map shows the countryside around Rennes-le-Château, overlaid with strange lines, geometric shapes, and points marked with initials. Most scholars dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, too convenient in its alignment with the flamboyant legend of Berenger Saunière. And yet, the coordinates do match certain ancient site dolmens, chapels, grottos, locations that predate Saunière's time by centuries. More intriguingly, the alignments seem tied not to mundane geography, but to celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, planetary conjunctions. This hints at something older still, remnants of Druidic sky lore, absorbed by early Christians and later concealed. Others believe the alignments point to burial sites, not of treasure in gold, but of truths in parchment. Among these cryptic references is one to Lambeau Diwa, the tomb of kings. This is not the biblical resting place in Jerusalem, but, according to certain traditions, a hidden burial in southern France. It is said to be the true grave of Dagobert II, the last Merovingian king, murdered far from the Basilica of Saint Denis. Some whisper that the tomb contains not only his remains, but scrolls affirming the secret lineage and its survival into later centuries. There is also the so-called Magdalen Trailin, informal pilgrimage, linking sense where legend claims Mary Magdalene came ashore to a scattered chain of chapels, caves, and mountain peaks deep in the Occitan countryside. Folklore speaks of a lady in red visiting these sites in the 12th and 13th centuries, sometimes accompanied by a child. In each story, she leaves something behind: a carved stone, a sealed jar, a letter no one dares to open. Then there is the shepherd's document, discovered in a private collection near Arles, written in a strange blend of Latin and Old Occitan. It speaks cryptically of a line of fire passed from the mount to the rose. To some, this is poetic nonsense, but to those versed in Masonic and Rosicrucian imagery, the mount, the fire, and the rose are all initiatic symbols. When drawn together, they trace a journey from Rennes-le-Château to the Roslin Meridian, an imaginary but oft-whispered line cutting through Paris and intersecting sites sacred to both church and craft. Long before modern thrillers turned it into pop culture, this meridian was discussed among mystics and cartographers who believed that certain energies moved invisibly along the Earth's skin. Could it be that the bloodline in question was not merely preserved in families, but encoded into the very geography of the land? Many of the so-called lost manuscripts tied to this theory are not truly lost, only hidden. Private families in the Languedoc region are said to guard heirlooms passed down since the Cathar era. In 1994, a researcher claimed to have seen a fragment of an illuminated gospel in which Mary Magdalene sits beside Jesus, her hand resting on a belly swollen with child. Before the document could be studied, it vanished back into private hands. Skeptics are quick to point out that every trail of parchment and every whispered map eventually leads nowhere. And yet, in the quiet between such denials, the possibility lingers, like the echo of a truth too dangerous to declare. For every genuine parchment that surfaces, there seem to be a dozen clever forgeries, each crafted to prey on the hunger of those desperate to glimpse a hidden truth. Some say the endless diversions of secret societies, encrypted manuscripts, and mystical diagrams are not signposts toward revelation at all, but deliberate distractions from one blunt reality, that there is no real evidence. Yet such certainty falters in the presence of those stubborn fragments that refuse to fit neatly into the official story. They linger like unclaimed puzzle pieces, jagged edges pointing toward something missing from the grand picture. Consider the copper-etched diagram said to have been uncovered near Montgar in the 1920s, a curious relic. Its surface is scored with the image of a fortress encircled by 5 stars. The stars are not scattered at whim, but arranged into a perfect pentagram, each tip of the star aligned with a physical landmark in the surrounding countryside. When the points are plotted on a modern map, the geometry holds as if the land itself had been marked and measured long before the arrival of surveyors' tools. Local whispers call it the seal of the Queen. But whose queen? Was it meant to honor the Virgin Mary Magdalene herself, or a more earthly figure, perhaps one whose blood carried the mingling of 2 ancient lines? The answer remains trapped between conjecture and silence. The landscape around these coordinates is no less cryptic. Not far away, near the Château de Blanchefort, strange engravings are carved into the hillside rock where the priest Berenger Saunière was often seen, wandering alone at night. The symbols are neither wholly Celtic nor fully Latin, but an unsettling fusion of the 2 looping jagged strokes that seem as much incantation as inscription. They have drawn generations of treasure hunters and mystics, most of whom leave with little more than muddy boots and dashed hopes. Yet they return year after year. Few are motivated by gold alone. Most are drawn by something heavier, an obsession born of the belief that truth itself has been deliberately hidden here, woven into the contours of the hills, encoded into the very geometry of the land. This leads to a tantalizing possibility. What if the final proof of the so-called sacred bloodline is not a fragile document hidden in a chest, nor a coded manuscript locked in a monastery vault? What if the proof is not ink on parchment at all, but a location, a singular place that has been obscured by centuries of careful misdirection? Such a site could hold not only relics and bones, but perhaps a written account explaining everything in unambiguous terms. If such a place exists, it would be the truest possible form of the Holy Grail, not a chalice, but a tomb. No one has found it. Yet clues, scattered like breadcrumbs, linger across parchment, stone, and rumor. And with each recovered scrap, each strange line drawn on a forgotten map, the image sharpens, not into a clear answer, but into a path that winds away from the familiar and into darker terrain. Follow that path, and the quaint villages of France begin to fade behind you. Medieval cathedrals give way to mountain passes where the wind carries a chill sharper than any blade. The air grows thin and cold, and in the distance there is the rhythm of boots striking stone, echoing through both alpine corridors and the dim crypts of ancient chapels. The year is no longer measured in centuries past. It is the 1930s, and the figure dominating this shadowed scene is Adolf Hitler. This is not the Hitler of the battlefield or the diplomatic table. This is a man enthralled not only by the machinery of power, but by the machinery of myth, a mind fixated on relics, bloodlines, and ancient narratives, which he sought to twist into the scaffolding of his ideology. It is the story of the Third Reich's secret pursuit of the Holy Grail, and the strange, unsettling things they believed it could prove. Many have heard that members of Hitler's inner circle were fascinated by the occult. Fewer understand how deeply that fascination was embedded into the Nazi research apparatus. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the SS, shaped the organization to mirror the knightly orders of the Middle Ages. Their motto, "Mein Ehrheit, true, my honor is called loyalty," was paired with insignia marked in runes borrowed from Norse mythology. Beneath these medieval trappings, however, lay a far stranger ambition: to prove a mythic, noble origin for the so-called Aryan race. This quest, according to their own records, drew them toward the shadows of the Merovingians. The SS established an institute called the Ahnenerbe, literally ancestral heritage. On paper, it was a scholarly body dedicated to study. In reality, its remit extended far into the bizarre. The Ahnenerbe financed expeditions across Europe, the Middle East, and even into the high plateaus of Tibet, scouring for relics, sacred sites, and ancient manuscripts that might legitimize their racial doctrines. Among its more audacious aims was the search for the Holy Grail itself, not as a vessel for wine, but as a vessel for blood. In their interpretation, it was both an object and a claim, a symbol of unbroken lineage. Himmler is said to have dispatched teams into the Pyrenees, the Black Forest, and the jagged mountains of southern France. One destination stood out: Rennes, the same village where Saunier had inexplicably enriched himself decades earlier, and where whispers of a bloodline secret had never truly died. The Nazi teams combed the area, interviewing locals, digging in ruins, and examining churches for patterns in their architecture. They were convinced the Grail had been hidden there, or that its location had been embedded into local legend and the stones themselves. This was not a hunt for treasure in the ordinary sense. It was a search for a pedigree within their warped historical framework. The Merovingian kings were exalted figures, noble, divine, and crucially, of Aryan stock. Their long hair, their supposed divine descent, and their early embrace of Christianity were all recast as markers of spiritual elevation. Himmler theorized that the assassination of King Dagobert II was more than a political killing. It was an act designed to obliterate a dynasty and bury with it a sacred knowledge that, if revealed, might challenge the power structures of medieval Europe. In Nazi interpretation, the bloodline was not merely holy, it was racially pure, a prototype for their ideology. Their fascination extended to the figure of Mary Magdalene. Some Nazi researchers, poring over obscure manuscripts, concluded she had not arrived in southern France as a fleeing disciple, but as a vessel carrying something far more consequential: children. In their telling, the Merovingians were her descendants, a union of the sacred and the European. This interpretation also drew them toward the legends of the Cathars, those heretics whose last stronghold fell under siege in the 13th century. The Cathars, it was said, had guarded a secret destined to change the world. The Nazis speculated that secret might have been the Grail or a genealogy. It is necessary to pause here, because this is dangerous territory. The beliefs that fueled these quests were not about uncovering truth. They were about seizing symbols and bending them to sanctify genocide. In the Nazi mind, blood was not a metaphor for divine connection. It was a biological hierarchy, a justification for supremacy. And yet, within the debris of their corrupted searches, faint traces of the original mystery resurface. There is evidence suggesting that the Ahnenerbe unearthed manuscripts in southern France, possibly genealogies rendered in code, that vanished into Nazi vaults. Some of these archives were lost or destroyed in the chaos of war's end. Others remain locked away. There are whispers, persistent but unproven, of phrases within these texts: the child of the rose, the covenant of the bee, phrases that echo through centuries of Merovingian lore. One of the stranger intersections between Nazi occultism and the bloodline legend was a castle, a fortress Himmler envisioned as the spiritual heart of the SS, a kind of Teutonic Camelot. Its floors were inlaid with the emblem of the Black Sun, a symbol with no official explanation, but associations with cycles of death and rebirth. Chambers were named after legendary knights. A particular room, unofficially called the Grail room, was constructed with acoustics so precise that sound seemed to vibrate through the bones. Rumors suggest rituals took place there, intended to awaken something dormant in the blood. Whether this was elaborate theater or genuine belief is unclear, but the precision of its design, its alignment with certain geographic and symbolic markers, suggests intention far beyond mere decoration. When the war ended, Allied forces seized vast quantities of Nazi records. Many of these documents remain classified. Others disappeared entirely. In the post-war years, stories circulated of researchers who vanished while investigating Nazi expeditions in France and Germany. A number had been chasing the same thread, the bloodline of Dagobert, too. Whether they uncovered something tangible or merely brushed too close to a secret still guarded is unknown. What is certain is that Nazi fascination with esoteric history did not evaporate in 1945. Elements of their mythology seeped into post-war occult movements, neo-pagan groups, and the tangled undergrowth of conspiracy culture. Stripped of its sacred core, the bloodline theory was repurposed to serve causes utterly opposed to the teachings of the man from Nazareth. This is no accident. It is a warning. If the Merovingian code exists, It was never intended to glorify one people over another. It was not forged as a tool of domination, but as a lineage of connection, a bridge between the human and the divine, the earthly and the eternal. In the wrong hands, even the holiest truth can be honed into a blade. That is why the pursuit of this mystery demands care. We do not follow it for power or proof, but for understanding. Somewhere, beneath the ruins of fortresses and the ashes of failed empires, there is a story waiting to be reclaimed. Not by those who would own it, but by those who would understand it. And so the path bends again. This time, it leaves behind the cathedrals that once echoed with blood-stained hymns, the war-torn archives of the old continent. It points west, across the vast expanse of the Atlantic. The old world recedes into memory, and a different landscape, untouched yet strangely familiar, begins to rise into view. Wind-swept Scottish cliffs dissolving into the shadowed embrace of pine forests, the air damp with the scent of resin and sea salt. Give way in imagination to the vast and unbroken stillness of early America, a silence so deep it feels almost sentient. One might suppose the tale of the Merovingians ended among the intrigues and relics of Europe, folded into dust and cathedral shadow. But there are whispers, persistent, stubborn, that it did not end at all, that instead it boarded a vessel under a false name, crossed the Atlantic, cloaked in secrecy, and found rebirth in another land. At the center of this web of suggestion stands a name, Sinclair. The Sinclair family, St. Clairs, of Roslyn and Habit, a peculiar intersection of verifiable history and tantalizing legend. Their ancestral stronghold, Roslyn Chapel, is more than a building. Raised in the 15th century by William Sinclair, it resists all simple classification, too rich in strange ornament to be merely Gothic, too unorthodox to fit comfortably into Catholic tradition. It feels instead like a cipher, long, patient message carved into stone for eyes that know what to seek. Look closer, and you find, hidden among arches and vaults, a mingling of iconographies, crosses beside stars of David, Norse dragons curled in stone shadow, even carvings of maize and aloe plants not known to Europe until after Columbus's voyages. And yet these details are dated decades before his sails caught the wind toward the west. Here the narrative deepens. Masonic traditions and Sinclair family lore speak of a voyage undertaken not in the late 15th century, but nearly 100 years before Columbus, by Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney. The story doubted by most mainstream historians, but unshakable among its adherents places. Sinclair, in 1398, on the shores of what is now Nova Scotia, some say he carried more than maps and men, sacred relics, documents, perhaps even the Grail itself are named in various versions. Skeptics dismiss it as romantic fabrication, but other clues lie scattered like breadcrumbs. Oak Island, that pit of obsession and ruin for generations of treasure hunters, bears the marks of something ancient deliberately concealed. Tunnels that collapse into booby traps, cryptic stone inscriptions, layers of engineered concealment. Whether the goal was to hide Templar gold, heretical scrolls, or some bloodline record, the intent speaks of a secrecy measured not in years but in centuries. Farther south, in Westford, Massachusetts, there is a slab of granite on which some claim a knight is faintly etched, sword drawn, shield lifted. Beside him, faint and disputed, a mark resembling the Sinclair crest. Geologists and skeptics have offered glacial scratches and modern forgeries as explanations, but the carving's stubborn presence in local lore has ensured it is neither forgotten nor fully believed. The connection to the Knights Templar strengthens the undercurrent of these claims. The Sinclairs, protectors of the order during its suppression, seem to have absorbed both its iconography and, perhaps, its guardianship. Rosslyn Chapel itself carries within its designs dozens of Templar symbols: the double-headed eagle, the red cross, motifs that speak in the visual language of hidden allegiance. It is said that when the Templars were broken, remnants of their knowledge and wealth were passed into the hands of trusted families' custodians who would safeguard the truth through chaos. Among these, the Sinclairs are often named. Beneath Rosslyn, legend insists, lies a vault, sealed, untouched, filled with scrolls, genealogies, and relics from Solomon's temple. Ground-penetrating radar has hinted at a hollow chamber under the chapel's floor, yet permission to excavate has never been granted. The stated reasons are practical structural integrity, preservation, but the effect is one of impenetrable mystery. Across the Atlantic, symbols that echo Roslyn's flourish quietly in early American architecture. On courthouse pediment, on the facades of colonial buildings, within the floor plans of old Masonic lodges, appear fleurs-de-lis, solar crosses, and proportions that match no official blueprint. Washington, D.C., a city laid out with Masonic precision, conceals pentagrams in its streets, owls in its geometry, and alignments that suggest knowledge of a geometry older than the Republic itself. George Washington himself, a Freemason, inaugurated not in a church but in a Masonic lodge, wearing the compass and square, the symbols preserved now in museum glass. The ideals of the fledgling United States break from monarchy. A declaration of liberty might, in this light, seem also a refuge for a much older sovereignty, one not crowned in gold, but bound in blood and oath. Genealogists, both conventional and speculative, have traced faint lines from early American families' names carved into Harvard halls and Yale gates back to European nobility, some even to the Merovingian. Statistically, the claim is hardly radical. Millions in Europe share descent from Charlemagne, but a smaller, quieter thread follows the esoteric stories, the ones that say Charlemagne himself was not the genesis but a veil, that the true line began far earlier and hid itself in plain sight. These researchers notice details: a 5-petaled rose carved over a courthouse arch, twin serpents twined above a library doorway, heraldry placed where no official record explains it. In one Virginia family Bible, passed down since the 1700s, a handwritten note in Latin appears beside the Psalms, ex sanguine regali of the royal blood. No explanation, no elaboration, only a simple claim in the margin, as though it were a fact too plain to need telling. As in all matters of this nature, the more one follows the thread, the more it blurs. What began in Merovingian Gaul, passing through the secretive hands of the Templars, may have crossed the Atlantic not as rumor, but as deliberate inheritance. If the bloodline needed refuge, Europe grew too dangerous, too inquisitive where, better to vanish than in a young and distracted republic. Its myths still unformed, its soil deep enough to bury anything. It could have taken shelter in a chapel carved like a code, or a Massachusetts farm whose only guardian is a granite knight in the weeds, perhaps in all of them at once. The clues are there, etched in stone, hidden in heraldry, arranged in street grids, quiet, patient, waiting for those willing to follow them into the fog. And now, eyes closed, one can imagine the cathedral again, but not of stone and shadow. This one hums with the cold breath of machines, aisles lined not with pews but with hard drives. It is the archive of the present, ancient texts translated into code, the dust of centuries brushed away by scanners. This is the digital age of the old mystery, where the search for the Merovingian line is no longer bound by the limits of geography or access. Once, a seeker needed PayPal approval, noble introduction, or decades of personal diplomacy to see a single guarded manuscript. Now, the Vatican Library, National Archives, and private collections are quietly releasing millions of pages, bulls, church ledgers, noble genealogies to the boundless reach of the internet. Somewhere in this tidal flood of data may lie the key. Artificial intelligence does not tire. It does not dismiss a strange coincidence or politely ignore a detail that does not fit the accepted story. It cross-references names across centuries, matches marriages between forgotten houses, and aligns dates with eclipses, coronations, and unexplained baptisms. One independent researcher in 2021 used natural language processing on thousands of scanned ecclesiastical records from the 13th and 14th centuries, teaching an AI to hunt for figures absent from official histories, yet present in important events. Again and again it found one, Maddalena de Sangri, always female, always present at royal baptisms, noble weddings, and sudden deaths. Her name invoking Magdalene and blood feels deliberate, like a signature in cipher. Whether she was a single person or a title passed from one custodian to another, her appearances cluster around moments where the survival of a legacy might be at stake. The researcher has since vanished from public forums. Digital excavation has also turned again to the dossier's secrets, the infamous Priory of Sion papers, long dismissed as elaborate fraud. Stylistic fingerprinting, measuring rhythm, syntax, and word choice confirmed. But one fragment resisted categorization. Its phrasing matched no modern hand but echoed the Latinists of the late Renaissance. It spoke, briefly, of the anointed blood in exile. Whether planted as a trap or preserved through centuries, it now floats in the network like a beacon, waiting for someone or something to connect it to the rest. The term had not surfaced in any recognized historical record before 1956. Yet in recent years it has begun to echo in unexpected places, in scattered references, across newer archival documents, in strings of encrypted text embedded deep in the corners of obscure online forums. It is as if a word, once whispered in candlelit rooms, has found its way into the electric hum of the modern world. In the digital sprawl, entire communities have risen with a singular obsession to track it, decode it, and drag its meaning into the light. There are Reddit boards where anonymous users post painstaking translations of weathered Templar manuscripts, Discord servers where images of Roslyn Chapel are magnified and dissected pixel by pixel, TikTok accounts charting the movement of ancient constellations above European cathedrals in search of forgotten ley lines. And between the noise, the memes, the hoaxes, the wild speculations, something else stirs. a quiet rhythm, a story. The kind that hides in plain sight, waiting not for the masses, but for a particular pair of eyes. Even the Vatican, guardian of the most jealously guarded archive in human history, has stepped into this new era. The apostolic archiver once accessible only to a select handful under the strictest supervision has begun to trickle out high-resolution scans to the public. But this is a fraction, a shadow of the whole. For every illuminated manuscript now viewable online, hundreds remain sealed. Artificial intelligence programs combing the database have flagged anomalies, cataloging inconsistencies, sudden gaps in available materials, cryptic reclassifications. Certain rooms, once listed in the archive's index, no longer appear at all. Key search terms have been scrubbed without explanation. Most intriguing are the documents from the early Carolingian period collections, now marked under review indefinitely, as though someone else is watching the watchers. Which leads to a more unsettling question. If one could train a machine to find the Merovingian line, would they? Or more provocatively, has it already been done? All it would take is a single well-funded organization with motive and access to the right algorithm, not to broadcast the truth, but to keep it, to guard it. Because in an age when transparency is demanded, secrecy must evolve. It must exist not in locked rooms or hidden vaults, but in plain sight, coded not in ink, but in absence. The new custodians, if they exist, no longer hide scrolls in crypts or carve warnings into stone. They embed them in metadata, in the invisible spaces between characters, in the noise of digital images. A photograph of a rose might contain an encrypted name. A virtual tour of a cathedral might hold, hidden in its timestamps, the coordinates of a grail-shaped shadow. The message is there for anyone to see and, yet only for a few to truly read. And so the grail itself shifts shape, once again not a cup, not a scroll, but a signal. A transmission moving silently through centuries, encoded in language, in flesh, and now, perhaps, in silicon. To some, this is nothing but conspiracy theory dressed in the clothes of history. To others, it is a lattice of truths, intersecting, resilient, impossible to extinguish. The bloodline no longer needs temples or knights. It may need only a password. And the right hands at the keyboard step back, let the fragments settle. The long-haired kings, the bees carved into ancient stone, names murmured in monasteries, maps traced in starlight, the labyrinthian archives, the monks, the masons, fascist treasure hunters, the algorithms, seen from afar. The story does not vanish into myth. The Merovingian dynasty ruled portions of Europe between the 5th and 8th centuries. Their authority came not from coronation, but from blood itself. They never cut their hair, believing it to be a conduit of divine power. Their Christianity was tinged with rituals older than Rome, an uneasy marriage of the cross and the oak. And then, as suddenly as they rose, they were replaced not by open conquest, but by decree. The Carolingians ascended with the blessing of the papacy, and the chronicles were rewritten almost overnight. Why erase them so thoroughly? Perhaps because they carried something the Church could not own, not heresy, but heritage, a lineage that claimed holiness was not conferred by the Vatican or by the mitre, but lived in human blood, in the womb, in the body of a woman. Recall Mary Magdalene, cast by early church fathers as a penitent sinner, stripped of any role as partner, leader, or mother. Consider Dagobert, too exiled, then assassinated, in a forest whose death may have been less about politics and more about preventing the return of a dangerous truth. Layer atop this the Priory of Sion, the Templars, the missing Vatican records, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Sinclairs, and now the digital breadcrumbs. Different names, same game. Protect the secret or destroy it. No one alive can prove the Merovingians descended from Jesus and Magdalene. But someone once believed it enough to kill for it, enough to preserve it for 3 centuries, in art, in symbols, in architecture, in flesh. If it were mere invention, why has it endured so stubbornly? Why hide clues in stained glass, in cathedral floor plans, in genealogies smuggled into dusty registers? Why paint Magdalene not as disciple, but as mother? Because perhaps the truth was always dangerous enough to require shadows. A bloodline not born of divine magic, but of human love, suggesting that the sacred and the human were never meant to be separate. In that notion lies something revolutionary, a church haunted by the figure of Mary, a world where power rests not solely with the crown or the crozier, but with inheritance itself. Dagobert, forgotten king, becomes more than a name. He is the thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire tapestry of divine right and replaces it with something simpler, older, and far more threatening to the structures that still dominate us. Where is the bloodline now? In a vault in Scotland, behind Vatican walls, in a Spanish library, or walking down a crowded street, its bearer unaware. Maybe finding the heir was never the point. Maybe it was about keeping alive the possibility that such a legacy existed. Power, when hidden, always leaves a trail of fleur-de-lis, carved too deep, a ritual slightly out of place, a name passed down without explanation. Here we arrive at the edge of the mystery, where the voices fade and the echoes thin. The path has run from tomb to temple, from cathedral to code, and the question hangs in the air like incense in a darkened chapel. Was it all invention, or the most carefully concealed truth in history? Imagine a vast library, silent and dim. Somewhere in its farthest aisle rests a single scroll, no title, no author, just a name and a bloodline. It might tell of kings who ruled by divine inheritance, or it might be nothing more than a story comforting, dangerous, necessary. History is not built only from facts. It is shaped by memory, and memory rarely surrenders what it clings to. There is no proof, no DNA that can tie a Merovingian king to the genealogy of Christ. But maybe proof was never the aim, maybe preservation was. And perhaps you be wondering, by remembering our part of that preservation. The Church had its reasons, the Templars, their oaths, the Masons, their riddles. You have your curiosity, and that is the most dangerous force of all, because it refuses to be silenced. Whether the bloodline still flows, or has long since vanished, may matter less than the fact that its symbols endure. The light still falls on Magdalene's face in stained glass. The whispers still thread their way through old stones and new networks, and the possibility, fragile, stubborn, still waits. The next time you stand before a cathedral, or study a painting, or feel the hairs rise on your neck for reasons you can't name, perhaps you'll think of it, perhaps you'll look again. And in the quiet, beneath the noise, you might hear the signal still pulsing, the line, still waiting.